Hello, friends, and welcome to the Nugget Climbing Podcast. This is Stephen Dimmitt. Today's guest on the podcast is Carlos Tkacz. Carlos is an undercover crusher who you have likely never heard of, but I really enjoyed our conversation. It was one of the most interesting conversations I've had on this podcast and spanned many interesting topics. Carlos is a teacher. He has a master's degree in literature and teaches composition or writing and communication. He's spent a great deal of time as a substitute teacher and as a community college professor in Bakersfield, California, and later in Bishop, California. Carlos is also an author. He wrote a very comprehensive training for climbing book that he gives away for free, which we talked about in this episode and which you can download for free in the show notes for this episode. You can find those at thenuggetclimbing.com. The book is targeted toward bouldering, which is Carlos' preferred discipline of climbing, and the program he lays out in the book is what has worked for him over the years and what has gotten him to V13. He has sent several of them, and he started pretty late in climbing. He started in his 20s. And he has also seen success using this program in training some of his friends and people on Reddit who he has given the book away to. So I definitely recommend checking it out if you are looking for some free training guidance. Carlos has also written 3 sci-fi novels, 2 of which are available on Amazon, and he is finishing the 3rd right now, and he thinks it will be available soon. He gave me an overview of the plot and the world he created in this episode, which definitely made me want to read them. And so much more in this episode. Carlos is a student of literature and of history and philosophy, and I found him to be incredibly insightful, and I took a lot away from our conversation. Thank you for tuning in, and please enjoy this enriching conversation, at least it was for me, with Carlos Tkacz.
Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it. Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it.
Do you want me to talk?
Yeah.
Levels, testing, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that looks great. I pressed the record button.
Yeah, good. That's a good start.
I want to be paranoid about that. Sometimes I especially if we're in like a good flow, sometimes I get neurotic and I check the recorder over and over again to make sure we're getting stuff. But after your story last night about your podcast and forgetting to record, that was going through my mind all morning. I need to press the record.
It turned out probably for the best because we were talking about Gandhi or whatever, and I had taken an edible during our break, and it started to hit me towards the end, and I started to get off on these kind of real ranty type things, which I don't know if it was better or worse. In the end, it never got published, so it doesn't matter. But yeah, definitely towards the end, we got way off base about why, I don't know, I forgot what he asked me, something about why we value Gandhi so much and versus these other stories of Gandhi in other places. And stuff like that. So I got real theoretical about it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to these stickers. What spawned the sticker idea? And you make them yourself? Or
I order them online and design them myself. Yeah. My girlfriend designed the California and the American National Parks one while she was at work one day or something when she was substitute teaching. Yeah. A good sub gig, you can kind of do other stuff.
Those are cool.
That was a while ago, and we have sold those before. But then during the pandemic, life was just rough for a little while there, especially in March, right? And when the first quarantine happened, and we didn't really know if this was the big one, the Black Plague or something. It was a really frightening time.
Yeah.
And we were living in Bishop, and so it was a really small community, and there was a lot of fear about that and people coming up. It was just weird. And so one of the things I started doing was reading a lot of history and philosophy, and especially things geared towards social justice. I told you last night that I got a reading list from a friend of mine who's really into this stuff and in the education world. And so I started going through that, and there was just so much good information, and I started posting quotes on my Instagram, and people responded really well. So then I was like, okay, how can I do my little part to make people happy or whatever? And so the first time I did it is I made a bunch of stickers, and I think it was a Baldwin quote, James Baldwin quote.
Okay.
Because I found one of his books really, really interesting. And I offered him for free to anybody who would donate to anything related to education or whatever they found moving. And then from there, I would just every now and then make some and mail them out to whoever wants some. And it worked out pretty well.
Cool.
Yeah.
Do you have a place where people can reach out to you and request stickers?
I mean, they can do it on Instagram. That's kind of how I do everything.
Okay.
My Instagram. And so, yeah, if they see any quote that they like, or I often will just make random ones and just offer them, whenever I see fit, and whoever gets them in the 24 hours that a story hangs out,
Yeah.
And then sometimes I still have like a bunch of those read literature, read philosophy, read history ones. And so if anybody wants those, that's fine. And same with the California ones and things like that. We carry them with us, and we have like a book of stamps and envelopes and things like that. So I can always mail them out.
Nice.
Yeah, it was... we also, another thing I was doing was like painting a lot and like doing watercolor painting, and I would mail out my paintings to people.
Oh, cool.
I actually ran into somebody in Joe's who I had never met in person, and he had one in his van and he recognized me.
That's awesome.
Yeah, just try to make small connections with people and lighten the mood a little bit.
Yeah.
And spread some good information or good ideas from thinkers like James Baldwin, people who dealt with some of the issues we're dealing with now a long time ago, and were a bit ahead of their time,
Yeah.
I was completely ignorant of that kind of stuff, and I'm like a reader. I've been reading since I was a little kid. And a lot of history and philosophy, and so to find this big hole in my personal information base, especially as somebody who's really like, as a literature major, the social justice is a big part of that, really, or at least environmental justice and racial justice. So the fact that I had never read some of this stuff kind of blew me away, and I figured I'm probably not alone in that.
Yeah. What were some of your favorites from that reading list that you got from your friend?
Favorites is a hard word because some of them are like infuriating.
Most impactful, maybe?
Yeah, that's maybe a good way.
Yeah.
Anything by James Baldwin. I can't remember what the one that I read was. It was like a collection of his essays and his...
Who's James Baldwin? James
Baldwin was I'm pretty sure I'm saying the name right. I feel paranoid that I'm getting the name wrong, but this is one of his quotes. Yeah, James Baldwin. I'm always want to make sure that I get the names right. And for some reason, I want to say Alec Baldwin.
Right.
But he was a essayist mostly, I believe, in the 60s and 70s, kind of like, and he was kind of ancillary to the Black Panther movement. He wasn't really with them.
Okay.
Actually, sometimes they butted heads because he was a little bit less militant than they are, but maybe a little bit more militant than Martin Luther King Jr. That's my take on it.
Okay.
And so he was a black activist. I believe he was gay as well. I can't be sure of that though, because I tend to focus on his writing and not so much his biography, at least with the reading I did. But his stuff, he also wrote essays or novels and plays, I think. And his essays are just super, super powerful. They're kind of like polemics. They're just like opinion essays almost. But his writing, I mean, as a literature major, I read a lot of good writers. I've read a lot of good writers, like the classics, and there's reason why they're classics. And so to come across somebody like him who, after studying for 6 years and having a lifetime in literature, who's like power with the word, it is still enough to really make you stop in your tracks and think about something. It's really rare, and I found that in him, and something I hadn't found in a long time.
Yeah.
And so like he was a really good one. The Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein. She's a Canadian investigative journalist, and the Shock Doctrine's about neoliberalism, and it's incredibly infuriating because it has to do a lot with like developing countries, and my family comes from South America.
Okay.
And so it actually takes place in Brazil. Some of the things they're talking about, I found that one to be super, super impactful, and almost that one was probably the most impactful because it really got me riled up, if that makes any sense, but in a way that like pushes you forward and makes you want to think ahead a little bit. So I found that to be super useful. The Harvest of Empire is about the history of Latin American immigration to America. Also super, super interesting. And hit home because my parents are from South America. So that one really touched me a lot, and really takes the, immigration is such a hot button topic these days.
Yeah.
But it's really not a new topic. It's been an issue for a really, really long time around the world and in America specifically. And that book really kind of covers it from the perspective of the different countries. So like Puerto Rico, Venezuela, Guatemala, Mexico. And talks about why the movement was happening and what the response was and how long it's been going on and the different law changes that have taken place in America about it and all that kind of stuff. So those three in particular, The Revolution of Everyday Life, who I can't remember the author's name. It's like a Danish author whose name I can't pronounce anyways.
Okay. I'll find it and link to it in the show notes.
That one was really, really good. That's the first one I read. It's kind of like a base almost like anarchist utopian work from the 60s and 70s. So it's got this like super utopian, like optimistic vibe that the 60s and 70s had, which is kind of nice actually, because so much of the other stuff I read was not very optimistic at all, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, there's more, and I could email you a list of the list that my friend sent me. I could email to you because
Perfect.
I've been actually emailing that list around to people a lot because people would hear a quote and they would ask about it.
Yeah.
I've also been trying to do not just nonfiction, but also literature that deals with this type of stuff, which can be a little bit more difficult to find, but like post-colonial literature, in particular, a book I read recently called Animals, People by, I think the last name is Singh, S-I-N-G-H. Again, I'm terrible with the names. They don't really require you to remember the names in literature. You just look it up when you need to. But that was a very powerful book about just impoverished groups of people in India. And I've traveled to India. I spent a month there once. And so that was really, really interesting and also a very powerful book.
I'm going to read this quote from James Baldwin that you have on a sticker here because I really like it. And this will give people an idea of what he was all about. The quote says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced."
Yeah, that one struck me and stood out. That's why it ended up on the sticker, I guess.
Yeah.
He was a lot of his writing. I mean, he was writing in a time when, you know, the civil rights movement was happening. But right now, we all know about the civil rights movement. We all learned about it in school a lot. But there was like a lot of pushback and a lot of resistance back then, and a lot of people who just kind of ignored it and didn't pay attention to the news. And I think that's kind of what he's getting at is, you know, he wanted to write and put these problems in people's faces to a degree so that they could face them, so they could maybe change them one day. Even though he talked a lot about how that's like a, you know, facing his own sexuality, facing his own, what he called blackness, I think, in his literature, was really difficult, obviously. And having to kind of come to terms with all that type of stuff and all the various things around it and the internalization of colonialization and all that stuff. It's like a whole theoretical framework that goes really deep in this stuff.
Yeah.
Which I had a little bit of background in from literature and post-colonial studies, but not nearly as much as I should. Yeah. Especially as a teacher.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. I'm excited about that reading list.
Yeah, it's. Yeah. I mean, it's painful. I had to start breaking it up with like something light, like a sci-fi book, and every other book. Okay. And I'm still not done with it. I took a break because it's just heavy.
Yeah. How many books on the list?
I think it's like 20 or something.
Okay.
15, 20. Yeah, and some of them are hard to get because they're like out of print or something like that, so they're really expensive. So then I would read like just another one by the same author, say. Okay. And it ends up working out pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your Instagram.
Okay.
Yeah, I was looking at it last night after we chatted, and you have a very interesting way of using Instagram. Like from, you know, if you just look at your feed, it looks like an average climber's feed. There's climbing photos, there's send footage and whatnot. But the captions are really interesting. Can you describe how you use your Instagram feed?
Well, yeah, you're talking about the quotes and stuff.
Yeah.
So that's a relatively new development, I think, in the last year. Because of the pandemic as well. So I got an Instagram, if you don't mind me backtracking a little bit.
Go for it.
I didn't have social media. I mean, I had like a Facebook I never used or something when it first came out when I was 21 or whatever. But I didn't really have a social media. I didn't have a smartphone until I was 27. So a little late in the game.
How old are you now?
I'm 34.
Okay.
So I've only had a smartphone for 7 years. And I got one because I was going back to school. And I was like, okay, I need to be able to check emails and stuff. And then when I moved to Bishop, I was offered one class. And it wasn't enough to pay rent, so I decided to live in a van, which, you know, is not that hard to do as a climber, and I had already spent some time in a van before. But very quickly, I became pretty aware that I was pretty alone, you know, in the van. I would buy like a 12 box of beer and be like, oh, this will last me a week. And then I'd drink the whole thing in like 2 nights and just watching Star Trek by myself. And so I wanted some more connection with the world, and I wanted to see what my nieces and nephews were doing and stuff like that, you know. So Instagram seemed like the clear one to do that maybe was like the least evil. And so I got an Instagram. I started posting, and I post like normal stuff. But then, and that went on for a couple of years, just normal sense stuff. And I actually made it a point to not post anything political online because it just never seemed like a fruitful space for that necessarily. Yeah. And my opinions on that, and that's still true, I think, but my opinions are a little more complicated about the whole thing nowadays.
Yeah, interesting.
Given how like prevalent social media is, and it's not really going anywhere. So during the pandemic, it just started to feel a little funny only focusing on climbing. And it's an important part of my life, and it's been an incredibly valuable and enriching part of my life. And that's something I want to share with other people, obviously. But at the same time, there's, you know, the world's exploding around us. March of last year with the riots and all that stuff and the pandemic. And there was a lot of people weighing in with their opinions, and I really learned a lot from other people on Instagram. But it's difficult for me to really give my own opinion because I just don't feel like I know enough about the world and things like that, right? And so I didn't want to start weighing in myself, even though I tend to be a really opinionated person. But I started doing that reading list, and I started reading, and I just realized that there's all this information out there and all this literature that has been so important to me in my life that a lot of people just don't read that much anymore. And so if I could suck people in with a cool picture of a climb, but then maybe get them to read an interesting quote from an interesting book that maybe will spark something for them to go check that author out or go continue down. Basically, I just want to use the Instagram these days to spread the climbing, but also to spread this other part of my life that has been really, really important to me. And also maybe the only reason I'm still sane in a lot of ways, you know? So yeah, I vary between quoting from literature and quoting from philosophy or quoting from history or nonfiction. And I try to make it topical and on point, and also try to give my take on it and where I come from with it, but also try to stay personal because I'm wary of telling other people what to do and what to think and things like that, you know? And oftentimes these writers who I'm quoting from just said it better than I possibly could. So I piggyback off of them a little bit.
I want to share an example. I scrolled through the last half a dozen posts or something on your feed, and I saw your send footage of Turbulence.
Oh, yeah.
At V12 in Leavenworth.
Yeah.
And Leavenworth is, 30 minutes from where I grew up.
Oh, no way.
Yeah,
you
it's
were
kind
talking
of
about that
a home area.
That was a lifeless boulder problem.
Yeah, it is for me too. Yeah.
Super fun.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah. I almost lost the mental battle on that one.
Really?
A lot. Yeah, a lot. I had a lot of bad days on that guy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Conditions or?
Yeah, well, you've climbed out there. I
Yeah.
come from the Southwest, so like humidity's not a thing. I did not know what that was like. So the day that I sent it, I actually went to it in the morning, and it was terrible, and I was super frustrated, like on the verge of throwing my shoes, which is not a good place to be, right? Like you don't want to be there. And then went to Steph, and she sent one of her projects, Raging Bull. That day. And then I got kind of psyched talking to somebody else and just realized how silly I was being, went back to it. It was nice and crisp and sent it in a couple tries after that. And so it was really bizarre. That was a good day.
Yeah.
It was a good day.
I'll link to your post in the show notes. You had a quote attached to that one from John Steinbeck, East of Eden quote. And I won't read the whole thing, but to paraphrase it, basically it's about how we all just want to be good and we want to be loved. And that most of our human vices are really just attempted shortcuts to love.
Yeah.
Why that quote for that post?
I read, Of Mice and Men when I was in high school.
And I should say East of Eden's one of my all-time favorite books, too. So that was the one that really stood out to me.
So then we can geek out a little bit because, I read Steinbeck like you're supposed to, and then I read Grapes of Wrath in my 20s or something when I was kind of on I've always read classic literature and been big on that. But I had never read East of Eden. I hadn't really gone back to Steinbeck for a decade or something. So I had a friend of mine who talked about the book, and I kept hearing about it kind of here and there. So I decided to give it a read. And I was just absolutely blown away by how beautiful of a book it was and how expansive and how just the depth of it and the honesty and the compassion that is implicit in his writing and explicit for that matter. It just, I had never read anything like it really. It was just one of those books that for me really reiterated why I have dedicated my academic career and to a degree my career outside of climbing and all that to literature. It was like reading Tolstoy for the first time. That's how good it was. And that's maybe the highest praise I can give because Tolstoy's my favorite author.
Okay.
And so, we were in Leavenworth and there were MAGA rallies happening on the street there on the main street in Leavenworth. And this is right before the election in October, and things were getting really, really rough online. My relationship with my family had gotten really, really rough the month prior to that, and partially because of my fault, because I was getting angry and really throwing that anger out at my family. Because they tend to be a lot more conservative than I am personally. And there was just so much vitriol and so much, everything, I don't know, it just seemed really crazy. And at the same time, I was out climbing and having this really wonderful time in this beautiful place with the person that I love and care about in the world, my girlfriend, Steph. And it was just a lot to take in. And something about Steinbeck's perspective on the world, and especially that, taking, what some of us would consider to be weakness in humans, their vices and the things they do wrong, right? The things they do to hurt each other. And he's able to turn that around and really see it for what it is, which is an attempt to be human. He's able to take the human perspective. I found that to be super powerful. And maybe like something that I personally needed to learn when I looked at my parents, saying I got in an argument with my parents about supporting Trump or whatever, you know? And so, yeah, I just thought for me at that moment, when I was reading that book, that quote and the other one about thou mayest, I think it was, yeah, it just his compassion really stood out to me, and his ability to take these characters who are, some of them are not great people, not people you want to hang out with, right? But he still gives them, you know, the love they deserve as humans, even though they're not real humans. That's the amazing part about it, right? And I don't know, I love fiction. So yeah, I guess the reason why that quote stuck out to me and why it stood there is we were coming up to the election, things were getting really weird and really rough, and in my own personal experiences with my friends and family, I was getting rough when it came to that type of things, and I was losing perspective of the humans I was arguing with. You know, I would argue with my dad, and all I would see is our differences, and I'd forget about all the wonderful things he did raising me. You know, and that quote really stood out to me as a way to try to bridge that gap again, and remember to be more human and look past that stuff.
Cool. Well, yeah, I'll share your post in the show notes so people can read it. Read the quote.
And they should read East of Eden, because it's a damn good book.
It is a damn good book. It is absolutely beautiful. Yeah. And to your point, he's so good at showing you how people might end up how they end up. You know? Like so much of who they are isn't something that they chose. It was, you know, the hand of cards that they were dealt, and it's kind of up to them to turn some of that around sometimes, you know. And,
it's a really.
But they have the power to as well. It's so beautiful.
It really brought home to me the point that when you meet somebody, you're really meeting them like at a moment in like this long up and down journey that is a life, right? Not to get too like new agey about it, but you just never know what somebody's background is. You never know what somebody's future is. People make changes and surprise you all the time. People do things. They come from different places, and yeah, he can really capture that, Steinbeck, it seems, in a way that's really specific to. It takes place in the Salinas Valley, right? And I grew up in the San Joaquin Valley, which is in central Southern California, and so a lot of the descriptions he was giving is just incredibly similar to the place that I grew up too. Places where I first started developing boulders and stuff like that, even. Yeah. And he talks about these farmers, and you know, my dad is a laborer, or was a laborer his whole life. He started working when he was like 9 years old in a factory in Argentina, and he's worked full time since then, and he still works full time. He's 57 now or something. Wow. And so he's owned his own business too, and he's had workers, and it just really struck a chord with me. It was really, I don't know, it's an incredible book. If I ever write a sentence half as good as that book, it'll be a good day too. Yeah, he's a special writer.
So you have a career now as a teacher? Yeah, I'm on a year off right now. Yeah. And career is kind of a loose word because I haven't worked full time as a teacher yet. Okay. I don't know if I'll ever work I probably will work full time one day. I'm 34 and I haven't had a full-time job since I was 21. Wow. Which a lot of people, I think, they think of that as a positive thing. And I actually like it because I'm not super keen on trying to make enough money. For me, it's good, or I want to make enough money, but I'm not super keen on making a ton of money, which is good because not as a teacher, I'm never going to have that issue. But for me, I've tried to take a tack in my life where I try to live as minimally as possible and then go from there. Which has worked out pretty well. So if I could work part-time until I die, that'd be great. I don't know if that'll happen because one day I'll be old enough that, you know, my other interests may fade away and teaching may be the most important thing. But so I consider teaching to be like this vocation of mine, something that I'm well suited to that really means a lot to me. But yeah, I work at the community college level. I have a master's. I'm in the middle of a year off right now that Steph and I took before we both go back to school. I'm applied for Ph.D. programs. Okay. And so I'm hoping to start a Ph.D. program in the fall if I get accepted. Steph wants to go back to school and start studying a science like astronomy or maybe physics. And so, yeah. What made you decide to go back for a Ph.D.? I just really like literature. Okay. I really like literature. Is that going to change the arc of your teaching or? No, probably not. I mean, it may just mean that I teach at a university instead of a community college. Got it. It may also mean that I end up at a community college. It's kind of important for me to teach at schools that, you know, serve the less economically advantaged population, which is community college or public universities. I went to a public university, CSUB. The only difference would be if I end up at a university full time, I have to publish and all that kind of stuff, like, you know, criticism or whatever it is that I decide to work on, probably eco-criticism. But
And I'm not super worried about that. I prefer to stay in the classroom. Maybe one day I would like to I would be interested in education curriculum development at a larger scale, because we were talking about it a little bit yesterday. The way we do teaching can be really, really weird.
Yeah.
And, when I was a substitute teacher, you go to kindergarten and everybody loves story time. And by the time they get to me at community college now, everybody hates reading. And it's just, there's something weird, something bad happens in the middle of that, somewhere. And I really want to know what it is. And I have ideas about what it is.
Yeah.
So we're going back for Ph.D. I'm really excited because when I went back for my master's, I just had such a good time thinking about literature all the time, like just really digging deep into these stories like Steinbeck, right? These writers. And oftentimes it had, their intention don't necessarily matter. You're just thinking really hard about problems that most people probably don't care about, but I think actually matter. I do think narrative and storytelling matters. It's kind of amazing to me how, Netflix is one of the biggest companies in the world, right? That's just a testament to the power of storytelling. That's how much we want to basically put a story in our entire lives all the time. Religion is a story. Branding is a story. Companies are a story now, right? Everything's a story. But most of us are really not very well educated on storytelling itself and the history of storytelling. And so as somebody who has studied literature, one thing that I've found that's really been helpful to me is it makes sense of the world around me, because it seems like the world is a bunch of stories we tell each other and ourselves. And so that's really moved me to continue my studies and to push farther and see if I can go a little bit deeper with that type of thing. Yeah.
Last night you were telling me about substitute teaching, and you were describing a discussion that you had with your kids at one point that kind of led to the moment when you knew that teaching was for you.
Oh, this was when I was teaching at the college.
Okay.
Yeah.
In Bishop?
This was in Bakersfield. So I was finishing up my master's. I was still working on my thesis.
Okay.
And so while you're working on your thesis, they let you teach. It's basically a way for them to get cheaper labor out of you. They don't have to pay you full wages.
Yeah.
But yeah, we were coming out of the computer lab. And so I teach composition, which is writing. That's what you do when you study literature. You teach writing because everybody has to take it, which is actually kind of fun because you really get a wide variety of people from the sciences, from sports, athletics, all sorts of places, because they all have to take writing. And this was in 2016 or late 2015. And I can't remember exactly, and I feel bad about it, but I believe it was the race riots in Baltimore were happening. And for me, I'm a white guy named Carlos. My dad's from South America. He has an accent, but he's also a white guy. My dad is first generation Argentinian. I'm first generation American. My dad's dad is from Ukraine. So there's like a lot of movement going on there, right?
Yeah.
And so race has always been a thing in my family in terms of like, I've always been aware of the fact that, I don't look like a normal Carlos, and people have always made jokes about it. When I was a server, people wouldn't believe me with my name tag. They'd accuse me of stealing the cook's name tag, stuff like that. And I always took a sense of humor with it personally. But it was becoming clear, seeing these kind of explosions of racial injustice again, which we're seeing now again in the last year, became clear that I was on the winning side of that, being like a white-faced person, and so I had this. I basically dropped my, I went into class that day, and it was the tension in the air was heavy because the kids knew the news. These students knew the news. It was all over the place, and I had a whole curriculum plan, and I just dropped everything. We just sat there for 2 hours and talked, and I just listened to them talk about what they. What their experiences were with this type of thing, and what they thought about it, and what they thought about the future. Because it became really clear to me in that moment that teaching wasn't, it wasn't a way for me to impose my will on the world. It was a way for me to try to help these people figure out what they want their world to look like. I'm going to be dead when they're going to be running things eventually. And I think that's better. I'm optimistic about that. And I learned so much from them in that conversation. But I also learned a lot about how I had an effect on them. Well, they drew a lot from the material in the classroom in the conversation, and that was something I didn't anticipate. And so this conversation was this weird synthesis of what we had been discussing in class already, their personal experiences in their life beyond the classroom, my personal experiences in the life beyond the classroom, and it came together in this moment where we could like really communicate in a way that felt meaningful.
What was the demographic of the classroom?
Mostly Hispanic kids.
Okay.
Mostly Hispanic kids. The Bakers, I think my class is like 85% Hispanic there.
Got it.
And then I had like 2 Swedish kids or something who were soccer players.
Okay.
Which was really interesting actually too, to have their perspective coming from, these kind of more social democracies, the Nordic model, economics, right? And so, yeah, I just remember walking out of the classroom, and I don't remember the conclusions that we came to because I don't think we had any conclusions. It was more like this moment of like solidarity, I guess is the word people would use now, where we all kind of like saw each other and recognized that things were messed up and that's not okay. But at the same time, realized that this kind of human interaction and this conversation that seemed really special to the classroom and really different from other places, right? Like it's not just being at a bar having this kind of drunken discussion with your friends, which can be fun. It was much more formal and much more civilized and much more directed than that. I don't know, I walked out of that classroom and just knew that this is what I wanted to do. This is like the space I wanted to engage in. I even called my mom and told my mom, like right then walking to my car. And I was almost in tears about it. It was really special. And I've had moments since that have reinvigorated that of similar experiences. It's not a one-off thing. And for me, it was really special.
When was that?
When did this happen?
Yeah.
2015-ish.
Okay.
Yeah. Like I knew at that point I might be a teacher because as when studying literature, there's just not, I mean, you can become a lawyer, not super interested in law. You can go into editing and publishing. I just like studying literature. And so teaching was the thing. And I just happened to get lucky that my personality fits really well with that type of thing, And so it just kind of this meeting of the stars. I just got lucky and realized it happened to fall into the thing that turned out to be maybe the best thing that I can do in the world personally, both for myself and for others, I hope.
So you teach composition, writing, and communication as well?
Yeah. So in Bishop, Bishop has a campus. Anybody who's been to Bishop that listens to your podcast has seen the campus on the left when they're driving up towards the Buttermilks out of town.
Oh yeah.
Up on East Main or whatever. Is that what it's called? I can't remember now. I've moved away for a year now.
West Main.
Yeah, West and East Main. That's right.
Yeah.
And so, when you drive up the Buttermilks, about halfway to the Buttermilks on the left, you'll see this building, and it says the Eastern Sierra Community College Center. So that's one campus. There's another in Mammoth, and they're tied to Ridgecrest.
Okay.
But they're super small in the Sierras, Mammoth and Bishop, and so they don't have a separate communications department. But everybody has to take public speaking because in order to transfer. So whoever's the newest adjunct, that was me, teaches public speaking.
Huh.
And I had never even taken public speaking. I took drama in college instead to like qualify for the same thing.
Okay.
And so there was a completely and utterly new experience. I had to make it up from scratch. And it was a lot of fun, actually. It was a lot of fun. And then I taught one literature course too. But at a small college like that, they don't do a lot of literature, unfortunately.
Okay.
You can try to incorporate it into your writing courses if you can, but it's difficult.
Got it.
So yeah, but teaching speech turned out to be a lot of fun.
Yeah. Have you been able to draw on that in everyday life?
Yeah. I have always been pretty okay at public speaking. I've always found myself, even when I was a kid, I found myself in positions where I was having to talk publicly. It happened fairly often. It was, I think, I'm not sure
why. Like in what context?
Well, I grew up in the church. That's
Okay.
what I call it. And so like my family comes from South America, and their family comes from Slavic nations. They're super super religious.
Okay.
Everybody in my family is religious except for me. But I grew up very religious until I was 24. I was on mission trips and all that jazz, and I found myself in front of the church all the time talking. It was not super uncommon. And I was uncomfortable with it. I was really uncomfortable, and I tried to push that away for a long time because it felt like a position of authority I didn't really like. But yeah, it's come to what I was trying to say is that I've just always been relatively comfortable in front of people. Substitute teaching was another thing, right? You just end up in front of 30 people that you never met in your life and have to kind of figure out how to explain to them the things you're supposed to explain. But then actually teaching it made me really have to think about what makes a good public speaker. And so I had this kind of intuitive knowledge of it and this understanding I could get up in front of the class and make people laugh or, kind of guide them to where I wanted to go. But I never really understood why or what I was doing or how to approach that. And so teaching public speaking actually was really interesting, like learning this kind of theoretical, background behind it and what makes a good public speaker, what kind of arguments there are, the difference between like having to focus on your credibility or logic or pathos. It was really, really interesting. And that's helped me a lot in my lecturing in my other courses. It's helped me a lot in situations like this where I have to think about how to present myself and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And it's made me actually a little bit more understanding of people who struggle with public speaking, because everybody struggles with public speaking. My students, like I always thought it was not that hard. I get nervous, like everybody gets nervous, but I've had students cry. I've had students turn around and face the wall. I've had students walk out. I've had students be super, super high during their speeches. The whole gamut of experience in that classroom. It's really, really, like, aside from just the struggles of teaching, it's super interesting to watch people in that kind of situation, because for a lot of people, it's almost the most stressful thing they do in their lives.
Yeah. I mean, there's those sayings that it's, scarier than dying for most
Yeah,
people. It's
yeah.
like the number one fear for a lot of people.
Yeah. And I think that's true. A lot of my students really hated it. But I pride myself on making it fun and low consequence and really getting people out of their shells. I really work hard to do that and kind of make an inviting atmosphere in the classroom and get some great speeches out of people. I have some really memorable ones that are fun.
That's amazing. I wonder, I don't know if this will go anywhere. Maybe it's too difficult to wrap up into like one point, but I'm curious, is there anything that you, any advice or like any insight you could give to people, for anyone out there, to help with like those butterflies and the nerves that creep up? Like, let's say someone who's listening to this is about to apply for a job and do an interview, or they have to speak in front of a small gathering for whatever reason. Anything that comes to mind?
We cover this in class, and there's a lot of different ways that the textbook that I use, which is a great textbook, it's called Practically Speaking. And it's really, really, it's like, you can't make a public speaking textbook fun. And this one's actually pretty interesting and pretty funny. But it gives it talks about visualization, it talks about relaxation techniques. These are all things that actually apply to climbing as well, which is kind of interesting, right? Like the, systematic tensing and relaxing of muscles in your body, making sure you eat before you go up there so that you aren't hungry at the same time, because that can be bad. But the one that is the most important, and also maybe the most cliche, is just to practice. That is absolutely the best thing. I've had students who would come in after class and practice with me, leading up to their speeches, and their first one would be awful, really bad, unable to get through it because they're so nervous. They're not even in front of the class yet, just nervous at the thought of doing it. But little by little, they get desensitized to it. It becomes less and less novel. It becomes less and less of a new thing, and pretty soon they become more and more comfortable, and it never goes away. That's another important thing, is you can't expect the butterflies to disappear. That's never going to happen. They're always going to be there. I've been lecturing for 4 years and then substitute teaching for 4 years before that. And before that, I was a climbing guide and instructor. So almost a decade's worth of talking in front of people in a formal capacity. I still get nervous all the time. But you just learn how to deal with it. You learn how to be in that space without really like giving too much credence to the nerves. It's almost like highball bouldering in a way, right? Like the fear probably doesn't really go away. You just learn how to compartmentalize it a little bit. And that really only comes through practice. And you can't necessarily get yourself in front of people all the time. Maybe you don't want to practice in that way. Yeah. But you can practice in front of your friends, in front of your family, in front of your mirrors. You can, in front of a mirror, you can record yourself and put it online and send it to people. That kind of thing works really well. Yeah, it's fascinating how that little red recording button is such a good proxy for having a live audience. Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. There's something fascinating that happens when you press that button and like, this was so interesting to me. When I started doing this, when I was recording the intros for the first time, I was by myself in my van with all the curtains closed. And as soon as I pressed the record button, and the thought that what I was going to say was going to be heard by who knows how many people, it was so difficult. I got so nervous, and I had to do like 10 takes for my first couple episodes. Yeah. And then, you quickly realize, like, okay, I can edit this, I can throw it away. But even knowing that, it still triggers that like animal, that lizard brain fear thing. Yeah, we talk about the flight or fight response in class. Flight or fight. And it's funny because that, evolved so that we could avoid being eaten by panthers or whatever. And now it's talking in front of people. It's not a dangerous situation, but our bodies interpret that way. And as real physical threat. Yeah. Even just the possibility, right? Like what you're talking about is not, there's nobody actually listening in that moment. You're just recording. It doesn't have to go anywhere. But the idea of it, the brain's a powerful thing. It's kind of amazing. And that's one of the reasons why teaching speech was so much fun, was because you really got to see people go through that process and work it out for themselves in a way that I hope benefits them in their lives. Another piece of advice that I think is useful is really know what you're going to talk about. Really know the stuff you're going to talk about. If you don't know it, maybe it's better to either do the research and really internalize that information, or move to something a little bit better and stick to the things you do know. Because when push comes to shove, you're probably going to get nervous. You might stumble and get lost. And if you really know the information, then you can pick it back up much quicker than if you are having to like look through note cards all that more. So kind of really making sure that you understand what you're trying to say. And there's a bunch of different ways to go about that, from planning to just being knowledgeable on the topic. That helps a lot, I find. Interesting. That makes sense. Yeah. Are there any deeper lessons or ideas, or maybe just like ways of thinking that you hope to instill in your students? That go beyond just the specific topics that you're teaching? Yeah.
What are some of the things that are most important to you to get
there
across?
Are two that come to mind, and one of them is maybe best summed up, and I'm probably going to butcher the quote, but it's Alexander Pope. I think he was like a 1700s essayist, like poetic essayist or whatever. He has this, he wrote a bunch of criticism and things like that. And also I think he wrote some poetry. I don't remember the poetry. But he said something along the lines of, and I think this is a paraphrase, a little bit of education is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or not at all.
Drink deep or not at all.
Drink deep or not at all.
Okay.
And his basic idea was that, I saw this as somebody when I was younger, and we've all met people like this, and we've all been this person before too.
Yeah, this is resonating. I think I know where you're going.
We have a really strong opinion about something we know very little about, right? And it's better to admit ignorance and not say anything than it is to go and bumble into something. At least when it comes to in some ways you got to fake it till you make it, right? The Hunter S. Thompson thing. I start every class with the Hunter S. Thompson quote. But at the same time, like when it comes to these really, really difficult social problems, like say racism or economics or education, in general, there's a point in our education system as Americans where we get really, really, really good at rationalizing anything we want, but we're not very, very good at rationalizing or applying logic to our own ideas. And I think that's what he means. I think most of us, especially myself, I came out of high school and I came out of my first 3 years of college super good at arguing with people, but never took the time to apply those arguments or those same filters of logic to my own arguments, right? And then once I went back to school and I got a little bit deeper into this and I got a little bit better at it, I started to separate myself from my own ideas and my own thoughts and was able to approach my own thoughts from a more critical perspective and basically apply the same rigors that I want other people to take in their thinking, the same kind of rigors that I was arguing with my friends over when we were drunk at a bar or something, and turn around and be like, oh shit, I haven't been doing that to myself. Like all my ideas are super faulty. And I'm here pointing faults in everybody else, right? And so I really try to get across to my students the idea that if they're interested in something, if they find something compelling, if they find something to be a good explanation, they should not stop there at that moment where that feeling exists. They need to dig deeper and really go past that and look up the problems and try to break apart the ideas they find compelling, especially if they find them compelling. If some idea resonates with you, you should be distrustful of that. You should go deeper and figure out why people don't like that idea. And usually there are two consequences. You won't believe that idea anymore, and that's a good thing. It was maybe a bad idea in the beginning. Or you'll believe it even more, and you'll be better able to defend it from others because you'll understand the arguments against it.
Man, I can see how this has played out for me. Like the two examples that come immediately to mind are training and nutrition, like two of the things I've been most interested in teaching myself about. And with both of those topics, those early enlightenments, those early really compelling arguments, those light bulb moments, I just wanted to shout from the rooftops and let everyone know. And then the more I've learned and the more I've experimented on myself and the more I've tested things and read, you just finally get to a point where you're like, I don't feel comfortable saying anything because this is so complicated. Yeah. It's so confusing, and I'm so less sure than I was at the start. So that really strikes home.
I read a lot of Zen Buddhist literature, and I'm not a religious person, and I'm not an atheist either necessarily. I wouldn't be comfortable with that label, but I really find a lot of inspiration from Zen in particular, for a variety of reasons. But they have this concept of the Satori, which is like these little enlightenments. At least this is my interpretation of it. I might be getting it wrong. Somebody who knows better might be able to correct me, but this is the way that I've used this concept, where there are these moments where you have like a flash of insight, something that, and oftentimes they're worth inspecting and they might be truthful too. But I think for me in my life, and this might be true of other people, I've often taken these small flashes of insight, these small satori's, as like the end result, like enlightenment itself.
I found the answer.
Yeah, and Zen Buddhism is full of these warnings about being careful of that. There's always another mountain peak. There's always more. It's never enough. And you're never. If you think you found enlightenment, chances are you're at one of these false peaks. And I find that to be applicable into almost everything that's worth thinking about.
Yeah.
That if you think you figured something out, there's probably something that you maybe didn't consider. Or there's more to think about it. There's one other thing that I try to get across to my students, and I do this in a variety of ways, and it's I can't remember who made the quote or whose quote this is, but it's something about a true education, or the sign of a true education is to be able to entertain an idea without believing it. And so that's, for me, what that means is, okay, say, I had my first semester teaching in Mammoth, I had 2 neo-Nazi students, straight up neo-Nazis, like absolutely neo-Nazis. One of them wrote an essay about why Nazism is the best political system and economic system. Another one would bring Mein Kampf to class to read, Hitler's book, like straight neo-Nazis. And it was really easy to, they would raise their hand, they'd say things in class, they'd want to talk after class, and it was really easy to want to just straight up dismiss them, and just completely and utterly be like, and that's what we would normally do, right? Because they're racist, number one, and number two, they're Nazis. Like, if there's ever been somebody it's okay to punch, it's a Nazi, right? But I worked really hard to spend time talking to them after class and really trying to dig out their ideas and understand why they believed what they believed. And that didn't mean that I was going to become a Nazi, but what it did mean was that I understood their perspective and I could better discuss it with them, and maybe, I hope, lead them a little bit away from that personally, because it's not my job as a teacher to really guide anybody anywhere in their thinking, but I think guiding away from Nazism is probably okay.
Yeah.
I think most of us would agree with that. Yeah. So I try to get my students to understand that, just because you're currently enamored with an idea doesn't mean that you will always be enamored with that idea. Just because you read Jordan Peterson and he really stuck out to you doesn't mean that in 10 years it's going to make any more sense to you. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good idea, that you should really think through things. And it's okay to think through them rigorously, even if you don't think they're interesting or worth believing, like flat earth or something. It can be a lot of fun to think about this stuff. I had a student give a speech on flat earth that was just fantastic. And he didn't believe it at all himself.
Yeah.
And there's actually a lot of value, I think, in entertaining ideas that are the opposite of yours, and realizing that you're not going to be tainted by that idea necessarily. Ideas can take hold, I think, and you do need to defend yourself to a degree, I guess. I was raised to think that a little bit in the church, I guess, I'm not sure how I feel about that now, but I think it's okay, and I try to get my students to think that it's good to look at the opposite perspective and look at the other side and really dig deep into the other side. Because again, either you're going to get your mind changed, which is maybe a good thing, because then obviously the other idea was better, or you're going to be better prepared to defend your perspective in the future, It's
amazing how triggered and threatened we are when our ideas get challenged like that.
Yeah.
Like how reluctant we are to do that. I feel like it'd be so much easier for all of us to have love and empathy and compassion for one another if we're better practicing that.
Yeah, and I think part of it, I was one of these people when I was religious. I was very much like trying to stay away from these things that would cause me to backslide and sin or whatever. And
I came from a religious background too.
Yeah, and so you kind of know how it feels.
Yeah, that's interesting.
A lot of my adult life has been reconciling the differences between me and now and me then. But sometimes I think that like you called it, being triggered by these other ideas, sometimes I think that just is a lack of faith in our own ideas. I believe that good ideas will win out, and that good faith discussion is a powerful tool, and maybe the best tool we have, like Sam Harris says, the best tool we have for civilization, and to increase the access and the purview of civilization, but also to keep it going, and so it doesn't explode on us. Because I like civilization, I like rock climbing, I like literature, only exists with civilization. One really good example for me, and like one personal experience for me that really hones in this, is when I was a senior in high school, I took like an advanced writing course because I got into that, and I was always been an okay writer. And I had this teacher, Mr. Ruff, who years later I actually was teaching next to him at the CSUB, which is kind of fun. And he wanted us to write an editorial, so an opinion-based essay, because we were going through the rhetorical modes. And he wanted us to write on something that was in the news. And at that time, I couldn't vote yet because I was 17. But at that time, gay marriage was up for vote in California. And it ended up losing this time. At that time, it was 2004, 2003, somewhere in there. And I was opposed to gay marriage as a Christian. That was my position back then. So he actually asked us to write down what we were going to write about and what our position was. And so he actually knew what we had intended. And then he told us to write the opposite perspective. So I had to write an essay arguing pro-gay marriage from the perspective as a Christian being anti-gay marriage. And I convinced myself through that process that my position was untenable in a state that is supposed to be non-religious and supposed to be a secular state, right?
Wow.
And so I actually came out of that being still a Christian at that point, but pro-gay marriage from a civil sense. And that really taught me the difference between my religious ideas and my civil obligations, know? And the fact that it was just an eye-opening experience right there, and actually digging into this idea from the opposite perspective had a tangible change in my life and my perspectives and the way that I treated others, for that matter. So that lesson, I try to think about that and think about Mr. Ruff and what he did there. and try to hopefully do similar things with my students and help them maybe fine tune their perspectives a little bit.
So can we summarize those 2 points? So the first one was drink deep or not at all.
Yeah, drink deep or not at all.
And then the second one?
The second one was the mark of a true education is the ability to entertain ideas without believing them.
Man, those are 2 great stickers right there.
Right? I know. I got to make more. I'm going to be just filled with stickers.
Well, you just mentioned some of your writing. I want to get to your writing, and I want to get to this training book that you've written. But let's talk a little bit about your own climbing.
Okay.
I guess first, so you've been on the road for the past year.
Yeah, off and on.
Yeah, when did you guys hit the road?
So we planned a year off.
Okay.
And we were supposed to end in May of last year when my job ended teaching.
Okay.
And then the pandemic hit and just everything went to hell.
Yeah, you were going to go to Rocklands for the summer.
Going to Rocklands, that would have been my 5th time. Steph's
Wow.
4th time. One of the benefits of being a teacher is summers off. And so none of that could happen. We were hoping to go to Europe this spring, had all this money saved up, which, we haven't spent any of it, which is, I guess, a nice silver lining. But yeah, so we've been off and on for a year, the best that we can, because it's a little weird ethically traveling during the pandemic. I mean, we're in Hueco right now, obviously. And in the beginning, it was much different because we had much less knowledge about what was okay and how dangerous things were. So we ended up staying in Bishop a little longer. We got lucky and had a long-term house sitting gig because Steph and I lived on public land for the 4 years that we were in Bishop.
Oh, wow.
So we've been, if you count that as being on the road, we lived in a van for a year and then we bought an 18-foot trailer that we would move every month from these various clandestine areas in the Sierra. So we haven't actually had like a fridge or a shower or a regular shower at least, or even a bathroom really. We didn't use our bathroom in the trailer because we didn't want to have to go dump.
Yeah.
For almost 5 years now.
Wow.
Yeah. We've been we're fairly committed to the outdoor life.
Yeah.
Which has been really special.
And it shows in your climbing accomplishments.
Oh,
definitely.
Thanks.
Yeah. But that's super cool.
Yeah, we've been trying to travel and one of the goals with this trip was as a teacher I get a lot of time off, but anywhere that's kind of fall or spring based, like Leavenworth is a really good example. We can't really climb in the dead of winter there. That's when I have time off as a school. So we really wanted to take the opportunity to visit some of these places like Leavenworth, like Joe's, like Roy, say, or the Southeast that are a bit better in the shoulder seasons when we're both going to be in school and working in schools for the rest of our lives. And so, yeah.
Got it. What have been some of the highlights that you didn't expect, having to pivot with COVID and cancel some of your trips? What have been some of the best things that have come out of that this past year?
It's been, there's been a lot climbing wise, like the Quarentraining actually turned out to be really, really good for both of us. Like having this
Quarentraining.
Yeah. So they closed the gym in Bishop. I immediately built a wall, like a 45-degree 8x12 training wall, and just like made some holds in. So we had the house sitting gig at that point. So in the front yard.
Okay.
This house sitting gig, and the people who own the house were okay with it, and it was completely freestanding, so we could take it apart if they weren't cool with it.
Is it still there?
No, I ended up selling it
right
afterwards, and it had some holds I made and managed to scrounge together some holds from an old wall I had and so we trained for an extra couple months because we weren't able to travel, and so it was like the longest sustained period of training I've ever had. Because the season before that too, I had gotten kind of demotivated on some of my projects in Bishop. Basically just didn't send anything, and except for one, I guess. And so I ended up starting training a little earlier than I expected, trained a little longer than I expected, and we came out of it both stronger than we'd ever been. So that was really interesting. Like I feel like I learned a lot, and also because we had limited facilities, right? I didn't have a campus board. I only had like a problem solver hangboard that you can hang from the rafter or whatever. It forced me to really get creative with the training and rethink the training and simplify, which I think actually helped a lot. Made me stronger. It got rid of some of the other things that I think were not necessarily hurting, but weren't the best use of my time. Which has been super interesting. Interesting.
I definitely want to circle back to that.
Yeah.
Some of the things that you've removed and
another thing that's been interesting is I guess I didn't really realize how much social interaction I get from climbing until it wasn't available when COVID hit. And that's been something that I've actually in the last month have really I've struggled a lot with here in Hueco, and have just turned the corner on like 3 days ago. Personally, I feel like, I've realized that like the social interaction between teaching and climbing, that was my social life in a lot of ways. And now both of those have kind of been ripped out, and it's made me realize that, sending is great. I want to keep sending, but sending by yourself is less fun than sending with somebody else there, and somebody there to enjoy it with you or to watch send as well.
Yeah.
And to support you and to share those experiences with. Like so much of us now, we, have to avoid climbing with each other at these climbing areas. It's the right thing to do, really, in a lot of ways. And that's been hard for me. And so kind of learning how much energy and happiness I gain from those social interactions, that I'm not this island of a human who's okay on his own. That's been like a big lesson for me in the last few weeks.
That resonates with me too. I've spent a lot of time in my adult life, in my climbing life, thinking that being a hermit and trying to be a climbing robot was the best way to go. And, it's never really worked. It's always kind of backfired in one way. And that realization has creeped in time and time again. We're like, oh no, you really are a social being. And that's such an important part of even remembering why climbing matters to begin with. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I started climbing when I was 23, and it really, in a lot of ways, I feel like saved me. It's kind of cliche, but it really, really hit me. And for a long time, I thought it was the climbing itself, the physical activity. I've always had trouble sleeping. I've always been kind of high strung, and climbing is like an exhausting sport, which is great because I can go to sleep at night. But now I'm thinking less about that and a lot more about the guys who taught me how to climb, the people who got me my first climbing job, like this guy who, he gave me my first harness and my first pair of shoes because I couldn't afford them back then. Like those connections, I'm starting to realize maybe are what actually brought me out of the path I was going to in life. This kind of like, basically I was doing a lot of drugs, and brought me back into something a little bit more social. It wasn't actually the climbing. And to a degree, it wasn't even nature. A lot of the time I thought it was nature, because nature is really important to me. Being outdoors is really important to me. And that continues to be important to me. But the people, I'd kind of taken that for granted before all this. And so it's been a big lesson for me.
Huh, yeah. So that's interesting. So you started pretty late. You started at 23.
23, almost 24.
Okay. You've been climbing for 11 years?
Something like that. Yeah, 11, going on 12 or something.
Yeah. And that's amazing. You've made incredible progress. I mean, I was creeping on the internet last night, and you've done well over 100 double-digit boulders and up to V13. You've done a few of them. You just did one recently. You did Diabolique?
I did Diabolique, yeah.
Yeah.
And the grade on that one gets all hard problems get argued with the grade.
Okay.
But I don't argue with myself. I'm pretty proud of it, and I'm pretty happy. And that's the one I wanted the most this trip,
Oh, cool.
It suits me really well, too. It's just like made for me. It's kind of my mantra is train my weaknesses, climb my strengths. It's like the way that I like to go with things.
Yeah. In what way is it made for you? Like
It's got a knee bar. I love knee bars.
Okay.
I find myself like pretty good at knee bars. It's also really wide climbing from insecure, and so it's more, instead of being like finger strength based, it's a little bit more tension based.
Okay.
And I tend to be a bit better at that. And the crux revolves around a compression move, which is my jam. So yeah, and it's steep. I like steep stuff because the holds tend to be bigger.
Yeah.
And the crimping is hard for me. But yeah, that one was the one I wanted most, and that was an interesting day too, where I went to it and I just was doing terrible, and it was super hot and super still and awful, and I got in a shitty mood and was getting, I've usually had a pretty strong mental game, I feel like, and then this last year, all the stress of 2020 and the pandemic and all that stuff has really weared on me a little bit, and I find myself getting frustrated more often than I normally would. And so we left the boulder problem, went to Steph's. Steph was working El Teco, and I took a moment. I was like, okay, just try not to be a complete ass. Try to enjoy her process. And so I got out of the funk a little bit, and then the wind picked up, and we went back and I sent a couple tries. It cooled off. Yeah, it was a special day again, kind of like Turbulence.
Yeah, I know. It sounds like a theme, but it sounds like those are
That's
two
this
of the,
year's theme. I don't
those
know
are
what's
two of
up
the
with
exceptions to the norm.
Yeah, and I mean, every year's a little different. The year before, I would project something and then, take a couple days off of it and then go back to it and do it first try. That was the thing that happened the year before, which is really bizarre. It's never happened to me in my life. Normally I'm 20 sessions on everything,
Interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, I started climbing a little late, and I feel really, I don't know if lucky is the right word, but I've gotten more out of it as far as sending wise than I really anticipated at the beginning, because I was not a good climber at the beginning. And out of all my friends, I started climbing with 4 or 5 friends. I was the least physically capable.
Interesting.
For sure. But I'm the only one who still climbs.
Wow.
So I think maybe a testament to consistency.
Yeah.
Type of thing,
Yeah. So I was reading through this training book that you wrote last night and stumbled into a part where you were talking about Patxi Usobiaga.
Oh, yeah.
Watching him in progression. Yeah. Can you tell me about that and the connection that you had to watching that?
So I started climbing. It was kind of a weird trick, like complete accident. I didn't even know there was a climbing gym in my town, and there really isn't. It's a small gym inside of a bike shop, like a large bike shop. That is just a complete accident as well. Like it should never existed. The owner hates the climbing gym, still hates it, but he's invested now.
Where was this again?
In Bakersfield.
Okay.
Not known for its climbing, not known for its climbing community either. And so I started climbing with a bunch of people, and at first, it was really just a way for me to spend time outdoors, be physically active, and still smoke cigarettes, drink beer, and do drugs. Like that was my appeal to it. Is all these guys loved to party, but they were still athletes, and I was coming from a party scene, and I was really down the well of psychedelics at that point in my life. Maybe potentially going off the bad end of that type of thing, personally. And so I really got into climbing, and it really just struck a chord, and I just needed something. I was unemployed at the time. This was right after the 2008 financial crisis. It was a mess. My dad's company had gone under, so I didn't have like my normal safety net like I normally did. My family was losing money and borrowing money from me. It was really scary. And climbing gave me this kind of way out. But it became pretty clear to me that, I played soccer growing up. I was not well prepared for climbing. I was easily the weakest out of all my friends. The only thing I had going for me at the time was that I could be pretty heady when it came to the trad stuff. We did a lot of trad back then.
Okay.
So I ended up leading a lot, and I don't do that anymore because I've injured myself several times, and now I'm afraid.
Oh shit.
But yeah, I remember really wanting to get stronger and just kind of almost despairing at the fact that like I'm too tall, I'm too big, you know what I mean? Like I don't really fit. A lot of the guys who were strong at that place in Bakersfield, and the strongest guy in Bakersfield, maybe doesn't even hold a candle to anybody anymore. This was a decade ago. It just, most of the climbers you see online are kind of 5'10" or so, right? And they're like light and strong.
Yeah, or even
weighed.
5'8", 5'7".
Very gymnast bodies in a lot of ways, and I'm this tall, lanky, thunder-thighed soccer player dude. And I remember watching progression and listening to Patxi talk and him talking about how he's not the most talented, but his talent is his mind, and his talent is being able to work hard and suffer. And I was like, I can be that guy. I might not be physically talented, but I can separate myself from my body, and I can force my body into this thing that maybe will perform better. And it seems to have, for me, it's worked pretty well.
Yeah.
I've gone lucky. And yeah, so I really drew a lot of inspiration from a lot of our culture, and a lot of the culture I grew up with, we're really focused on talent and like this kind of inborn talent. We love to see people who are successful fast. And Patxi's narrative was very different. It was somebody who had to work his ass off to get where he was, and to be equal to the others around him, and that really resonated with me. Especially in sports, I had always been passable at sports. Like I could snowboard, water ski. I was never that good. I was pretty good at soccer. But any sport I could pick up and play okay, except for climbing. I was terrible at climbing. And it was the first time I'd ever really like jumped into a sport and just couldn't even hang. At all, like projecting 5'8" on my first day climbing. Yeah. And it took me a full year to do my first V4 outdoors, and a year of climbing like a lot, like 4 or 5 times a week. Wow. It's not like I was, once here, once there. I was not good at this. Yeah. And so the idea of that there's a path other than talent to, my goals as a climber really resonated.
Give me a sense of your progression and what that's looked like.
As far as climbing goes? Yeah. So actually, when I started climbing, for some reason, when I started bouldering, really, V13 was like a goal of mine. I don't know where that came from, but I was like, I want to do a V13 one day. I think it was just like watching a bunch of Sharma videos and the dosage stuff. That was like kind of the hardest thing in those videos that was named, at least. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I spent the first 4 years of climbing or so, I did a lot of different types of climbing. Like my climbing, there were more weekend trips, and we'd go sport climb and do a bunch of easy rope climbing stuff and top roping. And I did a lot of trad too. A lot of the guys who taught me how to climb were trad climbers. So I climbed in the Needles and Dome Rock, climbed in Yosemite a bit. And so I would, like the first 4 years, I wasn't super focused on getting stronger and wasn't focused on training at all. That wasn't a thing. Climbing was still kind of, going out and having adventure days, which is a lot of fun in its own way. But I was also at the same time getting frustrated when I couldn't do certain boulder problems or couldn't do certain climbs. And so at some point, right around V5, when I was climbing like V5-ish, right before I was trying to do my first non-dyno V6, I'm good at dynos and I like dynos a lot.
Is this Dissin Euros?
Yeah. Is that in the yeah? So I wanted right around the time I was trying to do Dissin Euros, which is this beautiful, wonderful line. I realized that I needed. It's in Pine Mountain, okay, which is near Ojai in Southern California. Okay, it's a wonderful place. Not a ton of bouldering, but really nice sandstone and just a great hang overall, and important to my heart. That's like the place where I decided to be a teacher on my 25th birthday and all this stuff.
Wow.
So it's like really like sits as like this place in my being. I finally started to train, and I had no idea what I was doing, because there was just, at that point, I think DPM was a magazine, Dead Point Mag, and you just didn't have the wealth of training information that you have now out there, which maybe was better actually in some ways, because it can be a little confusing now. But that's when I started training and really started focusing on trying to get stronger, although I was still doing a lot of sport climbing and a lot of trad climbing at that time. And that basically precipitated this, this real time of trial and error in my training, really trying different things with my nutrition, really trying different things with my training, really trying to figure out what worked for me, because what worked for other people just didn't really work that well for me. And then there was also some ups and downs. I did my first V10 in Durango, Colorado when I was, I think 26 or 27. But then I didn't do another one for 3 years. And that was around the 3 years that I was a vegetarian and really like getting injured a lot and having a lot of trouble with keeping fit and strong and recovering.
Interesting.
And so, I didn't do another one for 10 years. And then right around the time that I moved to Bishop, like the year before I moved to Bishop in 2016, I had done a trip to Australia where I was sport climbing because I had a broken heel, so I couldn't really do anything else. I broke my pinky in Australia. It's all jacked up now.
Oh, whoa.
Yeah.
Look at that thing.
Yeah. So I broke my heel when a top rope in a gym failed, and I decked.
No kidding.
And broke my heel 4 days before I went to Australia. Went to Australia, spent a week in the city, kind of waiting for my climbing partner to get out of school. Went to the Grampians, broke my pinky on a trad fall on the first climb, the first outdoor climb of the trip. Climbed the rest of the month, and she like my climbing partner was a med student. She managed to get me some Vicodin, and I would just take that stuff at night to sleep because my pinky hurt so bad.
Wow.
And then I got back and I got an X-ray. I didn't have health insurance. This is pre-Obamacare. Got an X-ray at the school, and it was all jacked up and had fused all wrong. It had broken long ways and through the joint, like split almost in half.
Oh my God.
And it fused together, and he told me I needed surgery, but I couldn't afford surgery. So I had a friend who was an ortho tech. His job at the hospital was set bones. So I went to his house, chugged some beer, and he broke the pinky for me and put it in a cast. And it's still bent. I can't like hang one-handed with this very well because it doesn't quite reach sometimes.
Yeah.
I used to want to do some, yeah.
So your pinky, it almost looks like just the very last knuckle is like bent at a 45-degree angle or something.
Yeah.
Like you got a little hook.
It bends to the inside. Yeah.
Yeah, it bends inward.
Yeah, it's not normal looking.
Yeah.
And it's probably, I went back to the doctor and he was pissed that I had it taken care of in that manner. But once I told him, I got a little mad myself because it's an economic issue, which it shouldn't be, but it was. He basically told me they're going to have to probably take it when I'm older, like amputate the pinky because arthritis will be bad in it.
Oh, wow.
But that might have been the case anyways. After that, I did a trip to South America where I did a trip in Thailand where I did sport climbing, and then South America where I did a bunch of trad in the fray and did some sport climbing. But after that, so that was 2015, I sold my trad rack, got rid of the rope, and started focusing on bouldering and started focusing on really, really trying hard in bouldering and really wanted to do my first V11, my first V12, like really wanted to push my boundaries and start to tick off some of these lifeless boulder problems that I want to do one day. And for some reason, the boulder problems always appeal to me more than the sport climbs. Like I have a list of boulder problems I want to do, but I don't really have sport climbs in that way. So for whatever reason, bouldering stuck. And so it's been the last 5 or 6 years that I've really focused and tried to hone my training down and try to really better understand it. And that's also been the last 4 years I've done, more of the hard stuff. That's hard for me at least.
Yeah.
And really, I think progressed a lot in these last several years.
Yeah.
Personally.
Okay. So yeah, I was going to ask about Euros. So it's a V6. It was your first V6. And it sounds like, you just described that your training was haphazard and you didn't know what you were doing. But it sounds like whatever you did, it worked at least enough for you to crush this V6. And I think you even climbed it again because it just felt so good.
Yeah.
What did that early experiment with training look like? And I'd love to hear how that's evolved over the years and ultimately what led to wanting to write this book.
So the earliest iterations of training for me, I would bring these little note cards to the gym that would have like my session planned out on them. And that was like a big revelation. That was one of these satori's, right? Where like planning a session and not just going in and climbing and based on what you feel like, right? That was something completely different and really helped. But I would go in and I would climb for 2 hours and then I would hang board and then I would do some pull-ups and then I might do some core stuff. But there was no real rhyme or reason to why I was doing what I was doing and when I was doing it. And I realized eventually that, I'd climb for 2 hours and I'd get caught up in a boulder problem that one of my friends had set, some stupid buddy of mine, right? And I would end up, doing this one boulder problem that maybe focused on like a right hand crimp. By the time I got to the hangboard, my right arm was exhausted and my left arm would be fine. And I had this really like this heavy imbalance happening. I also didn't do anything with antagonists, and I didn't take care of my nutrition at all. At that point I was, living. This was when I lived in Thousand Oaks in the parking lot of the climbing gym, the Boulder Dash climbing gym down there. I only worked there for 5 weeks and then I ended up leaving. But that was right around the time that I really wanted to start focusing. But I was trying to live off of less than $10 a day. I mean, Taco Bell, and bananas from Trader Joe's is not healthy at
Taco
all.
Bell and bananas.
Yeah, and I was still drinking a ton, so,
and alcohol.
So very one-sided, just in the training, not in the nutrition half, which I think is a very important side of it. Hadn't taken over my entire life yet. And eventually I started to realize that if I wanted to send outdoors, I didn't need to think about sending indoors as much. And that's why I was doing those long sessions indoors before I would hangboard and before I would do my pull-ups and stuff. Because if I did the hangboarding and the pull-up first, then I wouldn't send the pink boulder problem in the corner and that would mess with my ego. But then I wasn't getting stronger and I wasn't sending outdoors. So eventually I switched over to, and honestly, just doing anything structured helped at all, for sure. And that's why I sent Disaneros. But eventually I started to move the pieces around a little bit, started to feel a little bit more about the different protocols of hanging. This is also a time when I did a lot of repeaters and not a lot of max hangs. For me, changing to max hangs made a big difference. Focusing on the hangboarding and the pulling exercises, I call them like isolation exercises, the things that are, much more balanced in the gym on the hangboard and on the bar or on the rings, that I think apply much more directly outdoors, rather than doing the run and jump boulder problems in the gym that are set. So changing my emphasis from indoor climbing to outdoor climbing, and then changing my training accordingly, made a big difference for me. And the training book, wanting to write the training book was also an accident. So I told you this yesterday. I self-published Sci-Fi.
Yeah.
And when I turned like 31 or right in the time I turned 31 or 32, my New Year's resolution that year was like, I always have like a climbing New Year's resolution. I want to do this grade or this many of a grade or this boulder problem or whatever, depending on what it is that year. But I also have been trying to do more like artistic ones or other types. Like this last year's resolutions, I've committed, and I don't have much right now, but I'm going to try to give 10% of my income to charity for the rest of my life.
Wow.
It's the We Will Give pledge. It's like this whole group.
Yeah.
This effective altruism movement and things like that. I'm plugging it right now because it's important to me at this moment. But that year I wanted to write a novel.
I'll link to that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and there's a lot of cool stuff. And Sam Harris has good conversations on his podcast.
It rings a bell, and it must be from him.
Yeah.
I've heard him talk about it.
He's big on it now. He's taken the pledge too,
yeah.
Which means more coming from him because he makes a lot more money. But I knew that I wasn't ready to write a sci-fi book. Like writing 80,000 words, I think my first sci-fi book turned out to be 80,000 words, is like, it's a lot of work. And I wasn't prepared. And so I knew I needed to start writing, and I also needed to start showing people my writing, because that's also frightening. And so I came up with 2 ways of doing this. I started a blog that was all climbing based stuff. And a lot of those articles, I've taken the blog down since then. A lot of those articles ended up in the appendix of the training book.
Okay.
And the other way was to write a training book. I was just figuring, I think it's a long project. It's a big project. It turned out to be huge. It's like 300 pages or something. 280 pages. And it was just a way for me to practice that. But it also helped me really to think about the training, what I was doing, why I was doing it. And I also just wanted to help other people who maybe couldn't afford a trainer or something, and give them this thing that, is not a silver bullet in any way, shape, or form. I don't think there is a silver bullet, but it's the information I think is useful, and many people have found it useful, at least as a stepping stone. And so that was the goal.
Yeah. And it's incredibly comprehensive. It goes way beyond just exercises and programming. I mean, there's like sections on attitude and the mindset, and some of it's pretty metaphysical.
Yeah,
it gets into,
I like that stuff.
The will and whatever else.
Again. Yeah, that stuff, it means a lot to me.
Yeah.
And that was the goal, though, was to write something that somebody could, because I had bought several training books, and they're all quite good, and from people way more experienced than I am and way more qualified and credible than I am, in my opinion. But oftentimes they took a very much a, you don't need to know all this stuff approach, so just listen to this thing kind of approach, right? They often seemed a little bit bare bones and didn't get as deep as I wanted into the mentality or into the theory behind it or why you do what you do. Sometimes they had lots of exercises, but no information on how to structure a workout. Sometimes they were super geared towards sport climbing and not towards bouldering at all. or they had like a small section on bouldering or something like that. There was always something for me lacking in all of them. So I wanted to write a book that somebody could read from beginning to end, and it might actually be an enjoyable reading experience. And after they read them, they would have the tools they need to indefinitely develop their own training plans and not rely on somebody else necessarily. And not just know how to do it, but maybe a little bit of the why you would do it this way. That was kind of the goal. So that's why the book is organized the way it is and starts where it starts and moves up from there. It starts with the theory, and then it goes to the phasing, and then it goes to the individual exercises and all that stuff. You know, from broad to narrow is the goal.
Yeah. How similar is this still what you do basically?
Pretty similar. I've made some changes.
Okay.
I've simplified my training a little bit. This book included, because this is the second edition. I did a first edition, and then I added some stuff afterwards when I got some feedback from people on Reddit.
Okay.
And the second edition includes like a section on intuitive training where you don't really plan things out as much. You do these blocks. I got that from a buddy, Matthias, who's an Australian climber.
Okay. Yeah, non-linear.
Yeah, the non-linear training. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
So I basically do something extremely similar still. I've changed my hangboard protocols a little bit. I do less hangs, but more, or less grip sizes, but more hangs of each one. If that makes any sense. I've put a more emphasis on VMAX, like the actual just trying hard. You know, I read an article talking about the Japanese team training, the Japanese like national team training. And what I got out of the article is they basically go in and they try as hard as possible every time they go to the gym.
Whoa.
And I was that was interesting because a lot of the training books I had read said it was okay to like leave a little on the table so you're better rested for next time or whatever. And something about the fact that it was the Japanese training team, and the Japanese climbers are incredible. And also probably
crushing.
some sort of weird cultural thing for me, liking Japanese culture in general and the samurai culture in general, which is ridiculous, but it is what it is.
I want to come back to that too.
Yeah. I just was like, okay, and also just the idea that their training is them causing themselves to suffer a lot. They just go in and they suffer and they work really, really hard. And that, of course, appealed to me a lot.
Is this like, do they go all out in the sense that they thrash themselves, or does that just mean like maximum intensity? Like
maximum intensity.
So like limit bouldering.
So limit bouldering on the hangboard, on the pull. It seems like everything they did, at least that's what I got out of it. And it was a very short article. So I was probably filling in a lot of gaps with my own prejudices or whatever. Yeah. Or my own ideas and conceptions. It just seems like they just do everything. They just go at it really hard, and they try really hard, and they don't leave anything on the table.
Well, it seems like that's such a consistent theme across so many of the best outdoor boulderers these days.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, like when I think of Daniel Woods and Dave Graham and Jimmy Webb, and I mean, I don't know. I haven't spent time with these guys, and I'd love to interview all of those guys, but I haven't. But it seems that they just limit project all the time.
Yeah.
Like that's almost exclusively what they do. And I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if they mix in volume. I mean, they're so strong that everywhere they go, they're going to get volume just because there's very few things that are hard enough for them.
Yeah.
But it seems like they limit project just about every day.
I remember reading, there was a while back, there was a video like 4 years ago, there's a video of Jimmy Webb flashing everything in Rocklands. It's absolutely incredible. All my projects that I had. and it was just out of control. And I remember reading a little blurb, I don't know where it was, but he basically said that 2 months prior to that, he went to the gym every day and climbed his hardest every day.
Wow.
Which is probably a lot more than most of us can handle.
Yeah.
You know,
one thing literally every day?
Yeah, that's what it said, every day. This was like a short Instagram blurb or something, so who knows how much detail he put into it. Right? It could have been an exaggeration. But so my sister, this will come back, I promise. My youngest sister, she went into gymnastics. She was good. She was very good at gymnastics. She's not a gymnast anymore. She's actually quite an inspirational story in her own right, in my opinion. But so she was going to be a gymnast. They actually thought that she had potential to be an Olympian, so they pulled her out of school. And I remember she was like 8 years old and jacked and like six pack and all. It was frightening. She was just like the buffest little 8 to 10 year old I've ever met.
This is your sister?
Yeah, my sister. Yeah.
How old is she? How old is she now?
She's 10 years younger than I am.
Okay.
No, 9 years. Sorry. Yeah, 9 years. I'm the oldest out of 5. But she eventually blew both her knees out.
Oh.
And what we learned in talking about this with the coach and stuff like that is that this is how gymnastics works. There's like a survivor bias.
Wow.
They push these kids crazy hard, and the ones we see in the Olympics are the ones who can survive the training.
Interesting.
And so to a degree, I think some of the best climbers in the world are people whose bodies are so resistant to the injury and can really take the stress that they put on it, that they can achieve these incredible levels just because of how much they can handle. which is insane and maybe not like
That
across the
resonates
board,
though.
but I think
Yeah.
it makes a bit of sense, right?
Yeah. Because there's a lot of other people that you don't see in the climbing videos that approach their climbing the same way as Jimmy Webb or Daniel Woods, but they just are injured all the time.
Well, and I've met kids who, not kids, they're not kids now, or maybe some of them are kids, but people who were comp kids and burnt out. They either burnt out emotionally or they physically fell apart and they couldn't take it anymore. Like I think that's becoming more and more of a thing. And so some of these people that we see who come out of the comp scene and jump into the global scene of climbing, they're the ones who survived. They're not my sister, whose knees didn't blow out or fingers didn't blow out, So there's a bit of survivor bias there when it comes to training from that perspective, which is interesting. And that's not my experience, obviously. I'm not one of these people who started really young and was really talented at that kind of thing.
Right.
But I think my body I've been active my whole life, and I'm lucky enough genetically that my body is fairly resistant to injury. And so I've been able to increase the intensity of my training without stopping, and I haven't had to stop for an injury for a long time.
Okay.
I haven't had a major injury since I broke my pinky. I've had like a few tweaks here and there, obviously that happens all the time. And I think part of the reason why I haven't is because I've taken a very structured approach to my training and tried really hard to focus more on the hangboard and on the bar than on the climbing, because overuse, people I think generally get injured, trying some weird tweaky boulder problem that's one of their buddies said or something, or doing the same boulder problem 1,000 times. The hangboard is nice and ergonomic, at least a lot of the new ones are, right? Those tension boards and stuff that are really nicely made.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've written this training book for free, and I'll link to it in the show notes, assuming that
you're
okay
welcome
with
to.
that.
I was going to say you're welcome to share it with your listener base.
Perfect.
Yeah.
But give me an overview of your program and your training philosophy and kind of what you describe in the book.
So my basic philosophy is that you should have a plan, and that the goal is to send outdoors, not to send indoors. And so that we should, as climbers, or for myself as a climber, I should focus on what I think is going to be most applicable directly to climbing outside, and worry a lot less about, say, sending my indoor projects. They can be useful as a way to get stronger, and also climbing's fun. That's an important part. It should stay fun. But if I don't send the pink one or the moonboard problem or whatever, but I do go out of my send phase and I send, my project outdoors, that's worth it. That's the basic philosophy right there. Having a plan, structuring the training, but then also just really focusing on what I think helps the most outside. And so for me, that means spending most of my time on the hangboard and on the rings and the bar. And lately, one thing I've added a lot of is a lot of moonboarding, a lot of board training. I haven't had a chance to really try the tension board and other stuff and kilter board as much. One of the reasons I like the moonboard is because the holds are so screwy and gross in a lot of ways that they mimic outdoor climbing to me, especially in Bishop, where everything's kind of like not uniform. All the crimping and things like that. And I tend to struggle with anything that's like a 3-finger crimp instead of a 4-finger crimp. And so I like those yellow holds. And so there's a whole chapter that basically explains those points in more detail and explains why, like the idea of having a plan and all this stuff, and why it's important and privileging the outdoor climbing as opposed to the indoor climbing. And then it goes from there into how to structure a single set, or how to structure a single session. It might go to phasing next, but we can talk about that in a second. And so I break down a single session into the warm-up phase, which for me is usually half an hour to an hour, at which point I do try to try something hard. Like if I have a moonboard project, I'll give it a couple of goes or something like that and hopefully send before I get too tired. But I find it useful to actually approach maximum effort in my warm-up personally. Like really slowly though. It's getting slower as I get older for sure. Then I break it into hands. So that's the hangboard or the campus board, depending on what you're doing. I'll spend so much time on the hangboard, maybe 45 minutes, but it's max hangs. I'm a big believer in max hangs personally.
Yeah. Do you still do any repeaters, or is it all?
Not really.
Yeah.
I did try something in the most recent structure, and I'm considering doing another edition of my training book, which we can talk about later. But one thing I did try, based on some things I read about and some things I heard some friends doing, was doing like a couple weeks of repeaters prior to a max hangs cycle, and that actually seemed to be pretty beneficial.
Okay.
But I did recently only have enough time to do the repeaters, and I kind of wish I would have done more max hangs, because I don't find the adaptation quite there the way that I want it. My fingers feel not quite as strong this trip, even after 5 weeks of training, as they have in the past, although I feel pretty strong in general and stronger overall, say. But I'm not having that peak finger strength that I get from a good section of max hangs in general. And so you have the hand section, and the book goes into detail about how to do that. And it also tries to break things down into beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And one criticism that I've had lately, because I've been reaching out for suggestions for this next edition, is maybe to have something even more beginner than where my beginner starts.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah, your beginner, I think, is like V3 to 5.
Yeah, and that's what I'm calling it. And the training seems to be... that might be my own survivor bias coming in. You know, I come from a background of relatively intense training as a goalkeeper, where I get soccer balls kicked in my face for 2 hours straight. And then after that, training is not so bad. And so I need to think a little bit more about how to ease up a little bit to make it less injury prone for people, or even just like the mental game, right? If you feel overwhelmed, you're not going to be very successful at completing 90% of your training sessions or whatever. That's one thing that I feel like I have a strength is it's pretty easy for me to go and shut my brain off and do the work and hate everything, but really not feel that, you know, kind of separate my emotions from my body. And then I always jump in from the hangboard. I always jump into doing what I call isolation exercises, anything that emphasizes arm strength. So generally for me, it's pull-ups,
Weighted
ring
pull-ups.
rows, weighted pull-ups, one-arm pull-ups, assisted one-arm pull-ups. I'm really a big believer in lock-off training, like one-arm lock-offs, even if they're assisted. I find those super useful. That might be because I have really long arms, and so the leverage when it comes to pulling is a little bit more difficult for somebody with a tighter arm base. And then after all that, and usually that's almost an hour right there, not including the warm-up. Then
So the hands and the
bar
is an hour combined?
sometimes more. It just depends on whether you're in the beginner or the advanced. And again, there's lots of rest in between. I'm a big believer too of like high intensity for short spurts with lots of rest. And then this is specific to bouldering, obviously, where you're only hanging on. You only need to be on the boulder for 20 seconds, 45 seconds tops.
Yeah.
Right. You know, like 4 to 6 moves, right, is the ideal. So there's differences, obviously, if you want to do more moves or longer boulder problems. Although I also take the Wolfgang Gulick, where if the moves are easier, then you won't need as much endurance anyways, right? Then I go to do the max hangs, or not max hangs, sorry, the VMAX, the limit bouldering.
Okay.
And so some people struggle with that mentally because, again, they're accustomed to wanting to perform well on that. And after hangboarding and after doing one-arm pull-ups or whatever, it can be hard getting on the board. But I find that to be valuable in a couple ways. If you're tired, you're going to be a little bit more open to your technique, and you're going to really focus on trying to be more efficient, right? Which is really, really good skill to have, climbing. You want to be as strong as possible. You want to be as strong as Chris Sharma, but you want to climb like Dave Graham outside, right? You want to be a wizard. And that can really teach you that. For me, it also teaches me to try hard when I'm feeling tired. You know, because sometimes that can be the difference between the single day send or the not single day send. Having to come back to something is really just biting down and doing it. It also, a lot of the times, the beta is just to try harder. And coming to, say, the moon board when you're a little bit fatigued, again, being careful for injury can really teach you that wherewithal and that really, like, you know, that grit. Sometimes if my fingers are feeling really, really tired, I will just focus on big moves on really good holds and just make it into like a power session just to avoid hurting myself. If my fingers are feeling strong and I want to work on crimps, I'll crimp down really hard on this VMAX session.
Okay.
That usually goes for about an hour. Sometimes longer depending on how I'm feeling. And I've been increasing the length personally for the last year or two. This is also where I'll include, especially for newer climbers, some drills, you know, like the lock-off drill is one that I find really useful, the hang-around drill, the feet walking drill, quiet feet, whatever, the skill-based drills after VMAX.
Yeah. Can you describe some of those? Like, let's start with the lock-off drill.
So the lock-off drill was one that I really like. Again, this might be specific to being a taller climber. I've always found lock-offs to be hard.
Okay.
Basically, you pick a boulder problem well underneath your max, and the steeper, personally, I think is better, but it doesn't really matter. You do whatever is in your range, and it takes some practice to figure out what is the right difficulty for you. And you climb the boulder problem, but you pause before you grab every hold. So if you do a move to a hold,
like hover.
You hover on it for a breath or two, the longer the harder, and then you grab it, and then you do it again. And there's a couple benefits to that. Number one, it's strength building, right? You're locking off, so it's going to build strength. At the same time, in order to lock off certain positions, you have to find the right body position. And so that really teaches you how to use your body efficiently as well. And that made a big difference on my ability to like crank down on a hold to my nipples and reach way past as far as I can. Because sometimes the difference between reaching the hold is like, you know, you can crank to your ear, but often you have to take it past the shoulder, right?
Yeah.
And that's hard for people. And that hover drill really helps with that. Another one that I like is you get on something really steep and you cut feet every hand move.
Okay.
And force you to bring so it's kind of a core workout that's brought in there, but it also kind of teaches you this dynamic movement if you struggle with dynamic movement. My girlfriend struggles with that a lot.
Okay.
She's incredibly strong, but when she has to jump, it's really hard for her, but she's getting better.
Okay.
So the hang around drill can really, really help.
I've heard those also called foot flyaways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of drills mentioned in the book. I don't remember them all anymore, but I think personally the hover drill is the one that I like the most, or the lock off drill. That's my favorite one.
Okay.
And then after that, in the book I describe going into core workout.
Okay.
And I've changed my take on that kind of stuff a little bit. I've learned to think about core in terms of strength building core exercises, so low repetition but high intensity, like levers or L sits or toes to bar, versus like things that are longer but lower intensity, like planks,
like holding a plank for a minute,
or crunches or something like that. You know?
Yeah.
And so I try to split my time between both of them and do a little bit of each.
Okay.
I've found the high intensity ones to be more useful. And then I also think planks are super useful for some reason. I'm not exactly sure I understand why, but they are just fantastic as far as like general body tension goes. But my core's gone a lot stronger stopping doing 100 crunches, or, doing like the Tabata timers.
Okay.
Where you do like 30 seconds of this exercise, 30 seconds of that exercise for 10 minutes or whatever, like those YouTube videos.
Those like Sufferfest
circuits.
circuits.
I've stopped doing those and started just doing L-sits or levers. I'm not very good at levers, so practicing those. And my core and roofs has increased a lot just from making that one switch.
Interesting.
So that's what's basically described in the book, with variations based on length and the amount of work you're doing and the amount of exercises you're doing on your level.
Okay.
Is how it goes into that. And it kind of shows you what percentage of each should be depending on your level. And then, it gives you these kind of slots to fill in with exercises. And in the back of the book are a lot of different exercises that you can use. And each exercise is described how to do it, but also describes what it works. So you can choose, the goal is for you to be able to choose, okay, I need to work on single arm strength. Well, here's exercises that work on single arm strength. I can plug these into the isolation section and work on those. And then there's often variations given to make them easier or harder.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. So you have like this whole chapter of options, and people can kind of pick and choose and fit that into this framework that you provide. I was curious, how do you think about what you choose? Is it just based on what you feel like is your greatest weakness at the time, or do you rotate between different exercises?
I rotate. So I generally, though, will focus on what's my weaknesses. And if I have a really specific project in mind, what that project requires. So if there's hopefully I have a project that I've tried and I know already that, say, I can't do this lock off, or I can't hold this crimp, and then I need to work on lock offs and I need to work on finger strength. So I generally base it on that. I base it on my weaknesses. And for me, my weaknesses are finger strength. And just generally strength in general is my weakness. I don't do a lot of campus sporting anymore because I have pretty good power in general that comes naturally to me.
Okay.
And so I don't get as much benefit out of that, although I really enjoy it. That's the next chapter in the book, is phasing. It goes into, you can phase it according to periodic. So 5 weeks of strength training, and then a week off, and then 5 weeks of power training, and then a week off, and then a couple months of climbing is the way it prescribes in the book. There's also nonlinear training where you turn everything into a certain blocks, and you do a certain number of blocks a week. And it doesn't matter when in the week you do them. You can do 2 a day, you can do 3 a day, you can do them back to back, you can take 2 rest days. It's supposed to be for somebody whose life schedule is a little less scheduled, I guess. And then the number of blocks you do and the intensity of those blocks varies depending on how what level you're at. Is the goal. And so I actually really enjoyed that type, but I'm a structure type of person, so I ended up falling back to doing the structures. Okay. And I've changed my personal protocols a little bit. Like this, what's described in the book is what took me in 2016. I had done 1 V11, and by the time I wrote this book, I had done 30 or something. Wow. Like that. And that's that this training is based on what I think and what I perceive from my personal experience having brought me there. It's also based on the training plans I made for friends and what I think really worked for them. Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Like, what kind of results have other people seen from this? I've done a lot of training plans for friends. My girlfriend being one of them. When I met her, she was climbing V4. That was 4 years ago. She did her first V10 last year. Wow. And so she's also like physically kind of a monster. Her dad does Ironman competitions. Like her family is very, very athletic family for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, she's had really good results. And doing V9s and V8s way more often than she used to. I had a buddy of mine who I introduced him to climbing. He lost 60 pounds in climbing. He weighed 240 and got down to 180. And he did his first V8s after doing some of my training.
Wow.
His girlfriend did her first V5 and 6 after doing some of my training, coming from like V3 within like a year or so. I've had other people, have specific projects and managed to send those, and that's worked out really well for them. I've had random people online on like Reddit and stuff like that, where I gave the book out for free, contact me to let me know that they sent their V7 project when they were starting out at V5. So it's been, I don't want to take credit for that, because a lot of these people, they just needed something. They just needed a structure. And one of the things that I do think I do a good job at, where maybe I'm not the biggest expert on training, is I think I communicate things okay. And I communicate things pretty well. And,
I haven't read the whole book,
to really
but
help people.
Just scanning through it, it's laid out really well.
Yeah, I think my organization and communication are my strengths. And for a lot of people, training information can be confusing, can be overwhelming, and that was the goal of this book, was to kind of like make it not overwhelming, make it not confusing, so they can actually apply it, as opposed to giving up. Or getting too overwhelmed that they decide they're just going to start climbing again. So yeah, I've had, I can't, there's more, I've had more friends who have had some success, and more strangers who had some success. But I don't keep like a running list of all that stuff in my head.
Yeah.
So yeah, it seems to have worked pretty well, and it's worked for me. And again, since I did my first 13 in the Rocklands, and I've made some changes to my training, and that's one of the reasons I want to do another edition, is to reflect some of those new ideas I have and some of those new things I've learned, because it's a constantly evolving process. Which is part of the difficult part about putting it down. But nothing fundamental has changed too much, really. Okay. Yeah, maybe just a bit more of an emphasis on the try hard in the bouldering room.
So it sounds like most of the time you're doing this periodic structure. So it's like 5 weeks of strength and then a rest week, 5 weeks of more power focused and then a rest week, and then you climb outside for a couple months.
2 or 3 months, yeah.
What does the rest week look like? Is that 100% off?
No, I go climbing.
Oh, you go climbing.
I go climbing.
Okay,
I can't not go climbing.
You just don't train.
Yeah, I just don't train, and I need to be sane. I got to keep. Yeah. I try to get 3 or 4 days of straight rest though before I start the next week. Okay. So usually I'll finish a training cycle. And the training program includes going outdoors for a weekend too, like the way that it's described in there, because I think it's important to keep remembering why we're doing this.
Let's touch on that then. What does a typical week look like?
In the training program that I describe? In this one, it's basically training on Tuesdays and Thursdays, doing fitness or antagonist training on Mondays and Wednesdays. And of course, these days can be shifted depending on what your work week looks like, but this is for the basic weekend person.
Weekend warrior.
Then climbing outdoors on the weekends.
Okay.
And that's it. It's really, so it's 2 really focused training days. I think for the advanced one, I might include some training on a Sunday too, after you go outside, some non-finger work stuff. But it was important to me to get outdoors once a week if possible, because not everybody can do that. I was lucky enough to live in Bishop when I was developing this stuff. But I find, number one, that helps me stay sane, because climbing is an important part of my, process of dealing with the world. But also, I think going outside regularly while you're training, maybe not having too high expectations, because you're going to be tired, obviously, but it can help apply the training better later. Sometimes people find a gap. They've been training really hard indoors and they go climb outside, and it's almost like they forgot how to climb outside. They forgot the differences between indoor and outdoor climbing. And so keeping that constant connection to outdoor climbing, or especially the area you want to be in, can really help. And I do find it useful to take a couple months off of training and just climb and have some fun and try to apply it, because I don't know, that's why we're here, right? It's easy to forget. Yeah. I even catch myself sometimes wishing I climbed outside less, because I think I'd get stronger faster. But I also might go crazy, explode, and never climb again or something, So yeah, for Steph and I, the last 4 years has looked like 2 12-week cycles. That's 5 weeks with a week off, 5 weeks with a week off. So 12-week cycles a year. Okay. Usually in the fall and then in the spring. So for us, it works around the school schedule. Got it. And then we'll have some send phases in there and things like that. Okay. Yeah. And so one thing I do want to add in the third book is, maybe that doesn't work with your life structure, and you have a little bit more fluidity, and you want to, be able to train and send outside kind of more or less depending on when the time comes available. And so talk a bit more how to strategize that and how to implement a training plan in that kind of uncertain circumstance. And then, so I things that I've changed, nothing fundamental, but my antagonist days look a little bit different. My fitness days look a little bit different. My core training has changed a little bit.
Okay.
And those are all things I want to reflect in the new edition if I get around to doing it.
You said something interesting last night. We were talking about the book, and you said, it was kind of an offhand comment, but I'm curious about it. You just said, there's a whole nutrition chapter in there, and I think you said it was all trash, and you're going to just throw it out or something.
Yeah. It's not trash, but I did say that. And I say that because I want people to think of it as trash.
Okay, well, what is the disclaimer there for?
The disclaimer is that I'm not a nutrition expert. People have eating disorders, and we should be wary about that. I've had a borderline eating disorder in the past, and I have a tendency to undereat. That's why I got so injured so many times, I think. The 3 years that I was a vegetarian, and no shade on being a vegetarian, I think personally I was probably just doing a bad job of it and not paying enough attention. I figured out later, so this is very much like a post hoc calculation, that I was averaging maybe 1,800 calories a day for 3 years. That's awful.
That's really
But
low.
I was eating all the time. But I was vegetarian, then I was a vegan, and so they weren't necessarily very calorie dense. And I was, but I would eat 1.5 pounds of mixed nuts a week, 1 pound of peanut butter a week, like way too much soy. More soy than is probably healthy for me personally. So I felt like I was eating enough. I just wasn't really like paying attention to making sure I was getting enough protein, and then everything exploded in my body. And so nutrition's become important to me since then. And for me, it's really important to count calories to make sure I get enough. So I actually know how many grams of carbs and protein and fat I get every day at a base. That's my base. I try to get at least that much, and then I snack over it if I'm hungry or generally.
Okay.
And I know it's not a very good or popular way of looking at things these days, right? With all this talk of
counting everything.
Yeah. The people would consider that neurotic and already on its way to an eating disorder. And that might be true. And for me, I'm dealing with, this past of having undereaten a lot and having to work through that specific circumstance. And so I understand that's one of the reasons why I'm really, really wary about including a nutrition chapter in the next one, because it's just such a difficult topic, and there's a lot of responsibility in there, and I am not up to the responsibility as far as like my credibility and my expertise goes in there. I don't have any. What I wrote in this chapter works for me, and it's worked really well for me. And a lot of it was gleaned before nutrition was like an open topic in the climbing community. So I was going to like bodybuilding websites, because those guys are full on shameless about their eating disorders. They don't care. They're willing to make that sacrifice, which is not good. But you can see it in the way when you read this stuff, like on bodybuilding.com, it's like, you're going to be unhappy, you're going to be starving, but that's the way it is. And you're just like, wow, not great. But they also, since the 80s and the Russians, right, and the Russian powerlifting and stuff like that became a thing, these people really know how to build muscle fast, how to build muscle in specific places, how to cut fat, how to cut weight. Wrestlers are another example of people who've been doing this for a really long time. Yeah. And they have a lot of information, and I think it's worthwhile. And so I gleaned a lot of information from that, also a lot of personal experimentation, but that's the thing, is it's very personal. And I do think some of the information there is useful, but Steph and I eat the same thing every day. We've been eating the same thing every day, like with minor variation for years now, and it doesn't bother us. And a lot of people, they can't do that. They need more variety in their diets. I actually prefer not having to think about it. I prefer knowing what I'm going to get and knowing why I'm getting it, and not having, it frees up space to think about more interesting things. Yeah. Whether or not I hate arguing about like, are we going to have pizza, are we going to have burgers, I just want to eat and move on. Yeah. I'm more like you. I feel a lot of mental freedom from having routine in a lot of things. And with my eating, and I mean, the way that it affects your decision making, all the way from what you're going to cook to how you walk through the grocery store. Like it really does make a lot of things simple. Well, and then, Steph and I have committed ourselves to kind of an economically minimalist life, and it saves you money if you know what you're going to get, and you're not buying a bunch of ingredients you're not going to use and stuff like that. So it's also been a way that we've been able to really be able to do this life that we're doing, while not having to work full time. Which has been nice in a lot of ways. Interesting. So in a third edition, nutrition has to be talked about because everybody wants to know about it, right? Like you don't get anywhere by ignoring it necessarily, and it's an important part of the equation. I would just prefer it if I had somebody like Katie Lambert write that section for me, or check that section for me before I were to sign off on it personally, again, responsibility is a big thing. And I've had Katie on the show, and that was an interesting conversation that we had last night about some of the things you learned from her. But I wish we had more time to go into all this, but I guess maybe simply, how well does that chapter reflect what you're still doing? Pretty close, yeah.
Okay.
Pretty close. I just try to eat more.
You try to eat more.
Yeah, and I try to be flexible with how rigid I am with it. So I still make a plan personally, and it's based on eating a little less on rest days, eating a little more on climbing days. Actually, a lot more on climbing days. So I'm kind of varying between low calorie and high calorie days. And then I also vary my carb, protein, and fat ratios based on the days. And that's all explained in there in the book, based on whether I'm recovering or whether I'm performing, I guess is the way that it goes. But now I try to be a little more flexible. So when I first started trading plan out personally, and again, this may go counter to some of the conventional wisdom these days, and this may be bad advice, so please take it with a grain of salt. I make my plan for my diet. Again, this is mostly based on the fact that I need to make sure I get enough and I get the right stuff. And then I eat pretty freely beyond that. I'll snack a lot. And I try to snack on mostly protein and fat. I try not to snack on carbs personally because they seem to affect me more. I seem to gain weight in a way that I don't like that way. So when I first started training plan, I eat pretty freely based on this base diet that I've made. And then as I'm getting close to my trip, I start to get stricter on the diet, still making sure I'm getting the right amount of food. But I start to cut out that little bit of excess that I'm snacking on. And I try to lean out a little bit personally. And then, so like I have a little extra weight when I'm training, which I think is good, and then have a little bit lean. But then as I go into a send phase, I let myself snack based on my needs again.
Okay.
Because I don't want to get injured necessarily.
Yeah.
And so I generally fluctuate between those two depending on what I think I'm at, what I think my needs are. It can be hard though, because I don't know. It's just hard. Like I'm a neurotic person already. I already have trouble with my diet, so I think this actually helps me. But like it's really easy to see how what I just described could turn really bad for somebody.
Yeah.
You know, and so I would be wary about that. I know people who don't have to think about what they eat, and they do fine.
Right.
I'm just, you know, this just doesn't work for me that well.
Yeah.
At least I don't perceive it as working for me that well. If I eat freely, I weigh like 190 pounds, and that's fine, I guess. But I started climbing late. My fingers aren't that strong.
Yeah.
They can't hang there.
Well, and it's hard too. I think it's a really unique challenge because we have an entire industry. Like if you go in the grocery store, the vast majority of the things in there were designed by people who are very, very smart, who know how to kind of hijack your biology, right?
Yeah.
Like we want to seek out nutrient dense or calorie rich palatable foods, and they are everywhere. So our modern food environment can really backfire on us if we just eat whatever we want whenever we want. So
yeah, and
I think that's what makes it so hard, because
when I find that having a plan and going into it with a plan is like almost defense against those people, against that marketing stuff, you know?
Yeah.
Because they're winning that battle for sure in every developed country in the world, and half the non-developed countries, obesity is an issue everywhere, right? So obviously, and it's weird because obviously it's a fraud issue, and it should be a fraud issue. But you watched the Light documentary recently. It's really, really good. Some of the things that I really liked, and I wish it got more into, although it had its own emphasis, and it was a good emphasis, is how, you know, we talk a lot about this heavy dieting stuff to be quite bad, and it can be bad for sure. But it's also, I think, what probably the majority of elite athletes do. And it really is a thing that we applaud in people without really meaning to, and we want to be like them. And this is part of the tool chest in a lot of ways, and that's unfortunate, you know. And I don't know if that says something about climbing or bouldering as a goal in itself, right? Because it's such a specific type of climbing. Like if you're a mountaineer, you don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. So it's really difficult to find the line through that, if that makes any sense, you know. And so for me, trying to go back and forth between you know, being strict when I really feel like I need to lighten up or lean up for a send season or whatever, and then letting myself go for a little while and just really enjoying food again. And, you know, Steph and I make sure to have red meat once a week, and once a week we'll have a giant meal with ice cream and everything, like really try to even that out and let go and let loose for a day. Cheat meal, we call it, and that kind of thing. That's really helped, those little kind of tricks. But like you said, our biology evolved in very specific circumstances in scarcity, and we don't live in that anymore. We live in opulence, and so it's really hard to find that line. And for me, the discipline, approaching it from a discipline perspective, which is another lesson that I've learned in my life that's really been important to me, is that true freedom for me comes from discipline and from the ability to control your impulses, not indulging in them. Yeah. And so applying that to diet, again, it's weird saying that after watching Light, and I would encourage people to be really, really careful and really search themselves about it and what they think is best. But for me, it's been really good.
Yeah. That's a perfect segue. I reached out to our mutual friend, Dave.
Oh, yeah.
Before this conversation. He's how we actually connected. I had met you a few days before, I think in the Martini Cave. And then I was, talking to Dave and he's like, hey, this guy wrote this cool book and you should really talk to him. It'd be really interesting. I reached out to him to see if he had any questions and he had several really good questions. I don't think we have time for all of them, but to what you just were speaking to, I'm going to read his question. This is exactly what he sent me. He wrote, my favorite part of his book was the mental training. He had a beautifully worded section on discipline, and it seems he got a lot of these ideas from martial arts. He says that we live in an age where we equate freedom with giving into our impulses, which has led to a lot of unhappiness, divorces, etc. Whereas he believes you gain more freedom from learning to control your impulses and not give in to them, and utilize your discipline. I thought that was beautiful and would love to hear more about that, as well as how he developed those ideas and values.
Yeah, this is something that's really close to my heart and really important to me, and comes from my entire life, basically, before climbing. I was raised... My dad... How do I put this? My dad is from Argentina. He came from an incredibly poor background. He's been working in a factory since he was 9. I think I already said that. And then he came and started his own business and lived the American dream. Right, and then lost it all in the 2008 financial crisis. Everything, the dream house he built, the car that he wanted, my college fund, everything was gone.
Wow.
And it was, for me, it was a really growing experience for me because I was like a bratty kid because I never wanted anything. Even when I was younger and we were poorer and pretty low class when my dad was first starting out in his business. He doesn't speak English, starting a business, just him and a spray gun painting houses. Pretty much no education, a 6th grade education in Argentina doesn't count for anything. Basically no education in America. They always sheltered me from the feeling the want or the need, say, so I never went hungry or anything like that. I never really knew how bad things were until much later in my life. So I grew up kind of spoiled and I was kind of spoiled and I was super unhappy and I had everything I wanted. My parents bought me a $40,000 sports car, paid for when I was 18.
Wow.
That was the year my dad made his most money. That was the year he was the most successful. And then I sold it several years later for $5,000. Because I couldn't sell it to anybody else and we just needed the money. And learning how to be happy when I didn't have very much, when my parents didn't have money, when I couldn't afford anything, versus how unhappy I was when I could just ask my parents for basically whatever I wanted. They would have paid for me to go to film school. They would have done anything. They helped me travel around and things like that at that age. The difference between those two, I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And kind of a moment of clarity came in one of my literature courses. And I do think literature is actually really good for this and really important for this. And I can't remember the exact poem, but there's a poem by, I think it's Tennyson, and it's a sonnet. And the sonnets have to have a very specific structure, right? They have to have a specific rhyme structure, and they have to have 14 lines, and depends on if it's Shakespearean or Petrarchan sonnet or whatever sonnet. But in this poem, he writes about how even though there are these limitations in this form of poetry, there's a lot of creativity and freedom that trying to live within these limitations really apply. And that really struck me. I knew there was a kernel of truth there I didn't understand. Several years later, I came across Spinoza, the philosopher. He's a Dutch Jewish philosopher who's really, really interesting from the 1600s. And he talks about a lot how, or maybe not a lot, but he has this section that stood out to me that talks about how true freedom comes from controlling your impulses, not being a slave to your impulses. There's a great book by Somerset Maugham called Of Human Bondage, and that's what he called our emotions and our impulses. Spinoza, he called them our bondage, our human bondage. And then you get the existentialism, condemned to be free, right? The dread that comes from freedom and absolute freedom. And then you get to Zen and Buddhism, where it's the same thing. We're slaves to our impulses. And I really thought about that for a long time, and it really, really struck me. But when I started climbing and when I started training, when I started actually applying discipline, that same discipline started to apply everywhere in my life. That's what allowed me to go back to school after dropping out 3 years, basically flunking out after 3 years, and go back, and now I have a master's. And I did pretty well in school, and I actually really enjoyed school. I went from a 1.8 GPA to a 3.97 in my master's program, and,
wow.
And that's because of the discipline I was able to apply that I learned through these works, and then also really learned through climbing. And I see so many people, and again, this is just the way that we live, and this applies to me too. And I've had periods in my life where I do this, where they work so hard because they think that being able to do whatever they want will make them happy. And they never really stop to think about the value of what they want. And that's where that discipline comes in, being able to really choose what's important and choose and know why it's important and why it matters, and then actually be able to chase it while, having to fight the casino machine that is our life right now and like the normal consumer economics, So the idea of discipline as a path to freedom, you see it in Bushido culture. You see it in almost every ascetic culture, from India to Japan to South America and all that type of stuff. You even see it in some ways in like the Beats and Kerouac and all that kind of in literature. Tolstoy talks a lot about it as well. It seems to be this kind of kernel of wisdom that has been passed around through almost every spiritual or non-spiritual tradition that values wisdom in of itself. Even Sam Harris talks a lot about it, but that we've really based our entire lives on the opposite. And that can be really tough, And so, yeah, I was a really unhappy, angry person growing up, despite all my obvious advantages. And I made use of none of them, and it's frustrating now to think about that and think about how much more I could have done and how many more people I could have helped, say, especially on that front, or how much better of a teacher I could be if I would have started thinking about this earlier. But better late than never. And at this stage in my life, learning how to really address and evaluate my impulses and really be able to sideline the ones that I know are destructive. Like I would love to smoke cigarettes again. I was just thinking the other day that I want one really bad, but it's terrible for you, right? And there's no world in where that's a good decision. Maybe 1 or 2 is an okay one, but I was like a pack a day back in the day.
When was the last time you had a cigarette?
Probably 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah.
I smoked from 18 to 24.
Okay.
Almost a pack a day. I quit because of climbing. And I'm the kind of person who can have one occasionally and be okay. Like a couple buddies of mine who quit with me can't do that. And they're slaves to that impulse, right? And it's really, really interesting to see. So, yeah, this concept of discipline and freedom from discipline was just so counter to what. I mean, it wasn't really counter to what I was raised in. I was raised as a Christian. That's part of Jesus's message, for sure. Like that's the Christian message. But that's just not the message that the church raised me with. That's not the message that they focus on. They focus on a lot of damnation and all that stuff.
Right. Shame.
Yeah. Shame is a big one. And so, being in the American consumer culture, which has a lot of benefits. I love having 35 different types of cereal to choose from. That's fine. But when it comes to actually trying to choose what's of value in your life, it can really be a detriment. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question or not.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing all that. Yeah, that's really interesting. It's interesting. I can't help but wonder, or I can't help but think, you're in such an interesting position now to be able to teach that lesson, because you have that contrast to point to from your own experience, like you were just kind of lamenting that you didn't take better opportunity of what you had earlier on, but it's really, I don't know. I think that's a unique gift, being able to share everything that you just shared and being able to see that contrast so clearly. Yeah.
And it's
there's
definitely
a lot of value in that. That's cool.
That's true. Like I wouldn't have that perspective if I didn't have the contrast between the two. And at the same time, like one of the reasons why I can think that way is because I didn't want. My dad growing up in a place where he was, very, very poor. He was born on a farm. His real birthday is December 18th, but his legal birthday is January 5th, because in Argentina, you have to go to the courthouse and get a birth certificate. And he was born, at a time when they didn't feel like going into town. and so that, not in a hospital, just straight up in a barn, at least that's my understanding of it. And he has one brother who there's a 6-month difference between his legal birthday and his actual birthday because the roads were washed out or something and they couldn't make it into town. He's much more focused. My dad's much more focused on wealth generation and stuff like that too, but because he grew up without it in a lot of ways. And so in some ways, this is a state of privilege coming from this, but I also, having been born relatively economically disadvantaged, I guess, in my family, from a family with no education, and from, my dad's a laborer basically, or was. And then to the point where my dad was buying me that sports car, to the point where they lost everything and I had to lend my dad money. It's really given me, I think, a unique perspective on all that stuff.
Yeah.
And really informs a lot of the way that I approach my life now, and a lot of the reason why I don't want to put my eggs in certain baskets, watching my dad go through that, because it's not like my dad did anything wrong. He just so the housing market exploded. That wasn't his fault, like completely pulled the rug out from under him. It was really amazing. And so in like an awe-inspiring way, in like the traditional sense of the word awe, like almost frightening to see how little control he had over his life, truly. And so for me, that's another aspect is being able to have some control in my life, in the things that actually matter, in the place I actually can. A lot of time we all spend time fretting over things we can't control, when there's a whole universe within ourselves that we can control. And we, like Sam Harris talks about this all the time, we live 24/7 with our thoughts and spend so little time trying to learn how to actually flex that skill. We just are on the ride of our up and down emotional thought train, and never really second guess it. And that's like, important lesson for me, that both applied to climbing, and then climbing helped solidify, and then applied back to the rest of my life. But it really wasn't until I started climbing that all this kind of coalesced and made more sense.
What are you reading right now?
Right now I'm reading, I just finished a book called The Global Imagination of 1968. It was a nonfiction book about the 1968 and up into the 70s, like the civil rights movement here in the States, and the hippie movement and all that. But it also talked a lot about different liberation movements all over the world, from Japan to Pakistan to South America, and tried to make the argument that what was happening in the United States, what we tend to learn about, and what was happening in France in the May Day riots in France in the 60s and late 60s was not an isolated event, that it was a major shift in the world consciousness, of way of looking at things. And it comes from like a very academic perspective. It's not like, I'm not a big fan of like New Age spiritualism anymore, personally. And so it's a very academic book, but it's super interesting and really hard to retain all the information because it just has so much information.
It sounds dense.
I'm also reading my own sci-fi book, like doing a read through of that before I publish it in a couple months.
Yeah, this is okay. Let's talk about that. So you said this offhand earlier, but I was fascinated to learn this about you. And I was actually on Amazon looking at your books last night.
Yeah.
So you've published a couple sci-fi books.
Two books.
Yeah.
2 books.
I don't have the name of it here. What's the series called?
It's the Cluster Saga.
Okay, the Cluster Saga. Yeah, tell me about that.
So
The Void.
The Void Within, The Void Beyond. The one I'm working on right now is The Terror of the Void.
Okay.
And there'll be a 4th book. And yeah, I just wanted to I didn't even want to publish. I just wanted to write a book. And I like science fiction. I've always liked writing. I wrote my first short story when I was in the 6th grade. And I remember really, it passed around the school and people liked it, and it involved some of the students in the school, and everybody had a lot of fun with it. And I really enjoyed it. And in high school and right after college, I wanted to write serious fiction, which was terrible. I'm terrible at writing serious fiction. I'm really bad at that.
What do you mean?
I'm just not a good at
serious fiction being like Steinbeck?
Like literature. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just not good.
Okay.
Maybe I'd be better now, but at the time I was not good. And it also was a very brutal and painful experience. It was like awful. I did not enjoy it, and I quit writing for like a decade.
Wow.
Other than the stuff I wrote in school, which I actually enjoyed a lot. And so when I wanted to write a novel, though. That's like an old goal. And so I was like, I'm just going to write a sci-fi novel. I'm just going to have some fun. I'm going to build a world that I think is cool, and I'm going to have some fun. And it turns out I can put in a lot of my own philosophical perspectives. And basically my sci-fi book's about religion and politics and society and the intersections of all that. The second book's a lot about extremism and things like that. And so I wrote a book, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I decided to self-publish it. And then I wrote a second book in the same series. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it turned out to be that. Now there's going to be 4 probably. I think after this one I'm working on now, I'm going to take a break and write a separate book that I'm going to try to seek a traditional publisher out of.
Okay.
Because self-publishing is fun. It's kind of like got this Wu-Tang feel where you're like selling CDs out of the back of your car or whatever, right? You're just trying to get people to read it. But it's also a lot of work, and it'd be nice to have somebody else do that. And if I ever want to make a portion of my income from writing, I don't ever want to stop teaching. Then I don't want to have the marketing is difficult, all that kind of stuff that you have to do, and I'm not good at that. I'm not good at selling myself. I'd rather have somebody else do it if they like my writing. But yeah, it's fun writing. It's really quite the fun experience, even separate from people enjoying it or people disliking it, which happens. Separate from actually getting it done and publishing it, just the experience of writing itself. Again, another experience in discipline. The way that I operate is I make a pretty detailed outline, and then I write 1,000 words a day until it's done. And so the first one took me 70 days. The second one took me 100. Last one took me like 80. And
wow.
I just don't even worry about if it's good. I don't look back. I finish it, put it away for a month or two, and then I go back and start working on it.
Interesting.
And that's been a really good system for me personally.
How involved is the revision and edit process after that first draft?
The first one was pretty involved.
Yeah.
There was like quite a bit of work. The second one was a little less because I do a lot of planning ahead of time, and I like my chapter outlines are relatively detailed.
Yeah.
So mostly it's just cleaning up to make sure that because my stories follow separate characters, so there's lots of timelines going on, making sure they fit together in a way that doesn't, like, say, reveal something too early. I had a problem with that with this last book, where I needed to really shift around some chapters. That was maybe the most difficult thing, and split some chapters up and change them to make sure that the timeline actually flowed. And then there's always grammar and typos and things like that. But they for whatever reason, I remember listening to a podcast one time that there are two different types of creatives, which this is obviously an oversimplification, but the ones that like really want to work on one project until it's perfect, and ones that want to finish something and then learn from that process and apply it to the next project. And when I was working on like literary stuff, I would just agonize over sentences, or like Hemingway or something, like just hammered drunk trying to just figure out how to get this idea across, and it was just the worst experience ever. And I never got anything done that way, and I never learned anything that way because I was just so busy reworking the same project. It just doesn't work for me. So what I learned through these books is, okay, my first book, I wasn't very happy with it. Some people liked it. But I learned a lot in that process. I moved forward and applied to the next one, which I was relatively happy with. And then same thing. I try not to get caught up doing too many crazy revisions, trying not to make it be perfect, especially because I considered these first 3 books to be kind of practice for when I actually try to write something I want to publish in a more traditional sense. And so they're all very different too. Like the first book is, and they're all kind of more Star Trek than Star Wars, right? They're a little more like based on ethics and stuff than action.
Yeah.
But like the first book is all about religion and economics. The second book's all about extremism, a little more religion. This book is very action based. I wanted to practice my action scenes, so I wrote like an outline that was a lot more space battles and stuff.
Okay.
And it makes sense in the arc of the story. But they are, and then the next one's going to be way out there, like psychedelic sci-fi. I'm excited for that one, actually. And then the one that the story I'm working on to eventually hopefully publish is more like an environmental-based sci-fi book.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. And so this series should be read in order?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I've had a couple people who have like randomly picked up the second one. They all work independently.
Okay.
They all exist in the same world, and the first book lays that world out. It's like the first Lord of the Rings, right? It lays that world out the most distinctly. But the storylines are fairly independent of each other and can be read separately.
Okay.
So they don't necessarily have to be read in order.
Can you give me kind of like the back of the book premise for The Void Within?
So it takes place in the 2400s.
Okay.
At this point, people have basically exploded out into the universe, into the Orion arm of the galaxy. That's the arm of the galaxy that we currently exist in, with all these different stars that are here. What happened is, after what I call in the book the post-Terra year, so basically right after this, a bunch of people in developing countries, once the gravity well problem gets solved and it's much easier to access space, a bunch of people in developing countries are just like, screw this, and they leave. They're tired of being exploited. And they end up trying to develop their own communities and their own economics on these different planets. And over time, they coalesce into 2 basic social groups. One is called the Coalition, which is a federation of planets that operate very similar to economic principles that we operate under today in the global economy. And then there's the Inner Cluster, which is a Eastern religion-inspired social utopia in a lot of ways.
Wow.
With some problems for sure.
Interesting.
But they are basically based out of like Islam, although it's not Islam, and they also have like a heavy Hispanic unit there. That hangs out there, and they include some other. There's also some other like there's some transhumanists that hang out, and there's like these religious ascetics that hang out too, and they do their own thing. But they're held, and so they basically want to keep their distance, these 2 groups, because they have very different fundamental world perspectives. But they're held in an economic balance because at some point somebody discovered this thing called the source, which is the source of animate life. The difference between living matter and non-living matter is this thing, and they eventually learn how to use it for energy, and it becomes an infinite clean energy source. But the Coalition has the technology to use it, and the Inner Cluster has the access to the only type of metal that is possible to actually utilize it. So you have one with the technology, one with the resources, and that forces them to work together. but it doesn't go that well, obviously. And so there's a bunch of other stuff that comes up in there, but it's all based off that tension, and it focuses on the inner cluster and follows this group of military characters and diplomats as they try to navigate the tensions between them. And eventually there are outside forces that come in and all sorts of crazy stuff happens. And so, yeah, that's basically it, I guess.
Cool. So the first 2 books are available on Amazon, on Kindle and paperback as well?
Yeah. Kindle and paperback. And then if people are interested in reading it, if you wait a little while, usually on Kindle, when you self-publish on Kindle, they allow you to give the book out for free for 5 days every 3 months. And so when I finish this book and I put it out in March, I'll make all the books free on Kindle.
Okay.
So they can pick up all 3 of them for free for their Kindle if they want. If they want a paperback, they have to pay.
Okay.
And I put them as cheap as possible. I'm not trying to make any money here. Really, the value for me comes out at this point in my writing career, I guess, comes from the feedback I get trying to be a better writer. I'm trying to get better at writing, get more comfortable putting it out there, and also building a small audience.
Yeah.
I've had several thousand downloads. I don't know how many people have read it, but I've had people reach out and say they really enjoyed it. It tends, some people don't like it because they say it's a little lefty, I guess, right? Like the good guys are a social utopia in a way. That's probably obvious. But it also it deals heavily with philosophy and religion. A lot of the action takes place in the characters' interior monologues, which is what I like in books. It's kind of an old style of writing, so there's not as much action except for maybe this 3rd book where there is more, because I'm practicing that. But yeah, I think if they like it and if they're willing to wait, they can get all 3 of them for free. And then if they really want to support me, they can buy a book in the future when I get published.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm excited for that. I've got my Kindle sitting right next to me here.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
I'll be sure
if you like
to keep
sci-fi,
in
they can
touch.
be fun. If you like Star Trek, if you prefer Star Trek, that's probably okay. If you prefer Star Wars, you may not like it as much.
Okay.
Yeah, that's kind of the way it goes.
I find myself trending more Star Trek as I get older.
That happens. I've
Right?
converted. I converted when I was 27.
Yeah, I think it's a really natural thing.
That's my captain's pips.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's what they're supposed to be, like a abstract representation.
Carlos is showing me a tattoo on his above his collarbone. That's what is that mimicking? It's like the stars
four
on the
captain pips. Yeah, they have their rank by these dots on their collar, and so this is aspirational. One day I want to be like Captain Picard in the next generation. So I got a tattoo to remind me of the example that he sets. I converted to Star Trek when I was a substitute teacher. I was like breaking up all these fights, and I remember distinctly I was subbing a special ed class, and they're like 6th graders, and there were these 2 boys like throwing blows, right? Really, really aggressive. It was really scary. And one of them, I realized later, was quoting Bad Boys 2, the movie.
Wow.
And the other one was just spitting like racist stuff that he heard from his family or whatever. And I was just like, what is happening? So I swore off any media that glorifies violence or trivializes violence for a year, which means I can't watch anything except for Star Trek. Turns out Star Trek, the old ones, especially the Next Generation, they make it a point that cooperation wins, not competition. The group wins, and they always solve their problems through the group and through science, not through violence in the individual. It's like the anti-Die Hard. And I really appreciated that.
Wow.
And it really, like, I spent a year watching it when I was in school. I'm not much of a TV watcher in general, and it just really showed me that you can use storytelling towards different ends, and that's what I think they were trying to do. I love it. I love Star Trek. Yeah.
So you guys, I should let you go here because you guys are off today. Where are you off to?
Yeah, we're heading to Roy for a week.
Yeah.
This is more my fault than Steph's. It's a little warm here now, so I hate climbing in the heat. But at the same time, I've been like really losing the mental battle out here.
Okay.
Which is funny because I think I've taken my own mental fortitude. This is something I've been thinking about the last couple of days a lot, so it's on my mind. I've been taking my mental fortitude, I think, for granted because I've never lived through a year like 2020, and I've never had it truly tested. A lot of the way that I've dealt with things is just considering them to be not important and not worth dealing with, I think, in my life, right? So like, say, economics and making money just isn't that important to me, and it's easy to wash that off. But race riots and the potential end of American democracy is a little harder to ignore. And also, realizing that ignoring it is not a good solution, especially as a teacher. And so I got real frustrated on a couple projects, and it started to do that, that voice in your head, you're getting weaker, you're getting weaker, you're getting weaker, be careful, you're getting weaker. Just like started to roll and roll and roll, and it was really in a bad place. And sometimes the best thing to do is to move on somewhere else and get new projects. I was struggling. And then yesterday I had actually a really good session on one of my projects, Tequila Sunrise.
Yeah.
And realized that it really is just the mental part of it. I was just getting tired mentally, and needed a break and needed some new rock.
Interesting.
So we're gonna go to Roy for a week, and then the weather looks really cold after that. And from there we might come back here.
Okay.
Because the weather gets good here. We want to head east because I've never been able to check out any of that southeast sandstone. Sandstone's my favorite. But the weather also looks pretty bad.
Okay.
It looks like it's gonna be cold and rainy. So yeah, it's funny because we made the plan to leave because I was struggling mentally. And then all of a sudden, through a couple conversations I've had with my girlfriend, through really like evaluating myself and really taking the time to do that, and also just realizing that it's okay to struggle mentally. Like, it's not necessarily a sign of weakness. It's just a part of the game. And I have a good friend that I talked to for a while, and he helped me out a lot with that. He went through like a catastrophic injury recently. He severed his bicep tendon on a climb in Roy, actually, and he couldn't climb for a year. And he's done a lot of mental work through that, had to.
Yeah.
So talking to him was really helpful. And then, yesterday I had a really good time and didn't want to leave all of a sudden. It's funny how like whims, like it's just the whims of the ego,
It's fascinating how quickly that can change.
And like I'm
day to day.
Who works hard to keep that at bay, not keep it at bay, but to realize that like I am not my thoughts. I am not those ups and downs. That is not who I am. I'm separate from that. And I feel pretty good about that generally, but I let my guard down for a little while and I collapsed straight into identifying with that voice. And that was bad for like a week there. And that was not very fun to be around. Steph's a saint.
Well, maybe you'll have some better conditions in Roy and then you'll be psyched to come back.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, the psych always comes back.
Yeah, it's always good to leave somewhere when part of you doesn't want to. Keeps you hungry to come back.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah. This is something I ask everybody. What is something you've been feeling especially grateful for lately?
I've been feeling especially grateful for Steph, my girlfriend. It sounds pretty cliche. I'm the kind of person who always wants to talk to people and always wants to put myself out there, kind of. I struggle with that a lot, but I like have a strong personality, and she tends to hang back a little bit more. And she tends to maybe, stay in the background a little bit more and let me talk and stuff like that. And it's really become apparent to me in the last year how much what else she does to make sure that we have a good time, that our lives are fun, that our lives are special. Even sometimes she's a fantastic cook and she can make all sorts of crazy things on our cheat meal days, or even take the normal diet that we have and change it in a way that makes it special. In the van, and our van's like a pretty small one. Our kitchen setup's difficult, at best. And so she just does a lot of little things that make my life easier without really realizing it. And I've taken that for granted, I think, periodically. And so, especially with this mental stuff that I've been struggling with the last few days, I've been really hard to be around. I think I've been really negative about myself and about things in general. And she basically puts up with it. And it's really amazing. And I'm really lucky to have that in general, so that sounds super cliche to say my girlfriend,
awesome.
But I love her, and she's made my life infinitely better, I think, than when I didn't have her in there, which is kind of amazing. And I spend less money when she's around too, which is crazy. I feel like that's not a common thing with dating. No, yeah, she's very good at saving money and making sure things.
You guys seem very aligned.
Yeah, it works
cool.
out well. Yeah, I mean, it's not very many people that would be willing to live, without a toilet for 4 years, for 5 years, without regular access to a toilet.
Yeah.
But that's what we did.
Yeah.
She was fine with it. That we didn't have a heater, and it gets cold in Bishop.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it does. Like single digits.
Yeah. It's fun.
Final question. What do you feel most excited to learn about right now? What's got you feeling curious?
Man, that is an excellent question. I'm always like juggling so many different things and ideas in my head between all the books. This last year has been really, really dedicated to social justice. And not just, I read like The End of Policing, right? Which is a super, super lefty book, like so lefty that even somebody who's pretty left, like I consider myself a philosophical anarchist, actually, which is like an obscure position that isn't actually an anarchist. I'm not actually an anarchist, but it's just a way of thinking of things that I find really useful based on this essay in Defense of Anarchism from 1977 by Wolf that I just really struck with me. And so not just, this new social justice stuff, but also like the theory that's been building up to it since the 1800s, since Marx in a lot of ways, right? We use a lot of Marx thinking in literature, not in terms of like communist thinking, but in terms of thinking of literature in economic form. Like, what does this literature say about the economics of the time? That's one thing that I struggle with when people are really against Marx, is we all think like Marx now, because Marx invented the way of thinking of history. Marx and Engels, he taught us to think of history in terms of class and in terms of economics. Before that, nobody did that. After that, we all do that. We're all Marxists, whether you like it or not. Doesn't mean we're all communists, for sure. That's something way different. And so I've been reading a lot of that stuff, some of those books I mentioned earlier. And what I'm really excited about is these Ph.D. programs I'm going into, hopefully, I will be teaching as well. I'll be teaching composition, and I'm excited to try to find a way to incorporate some of that information into my class structure without obviously being prescriptive about it, without trying to show my students that this is the way they should think or something, because I don't believe that. I just think that if you're going to make a decision about how you want to live your life and how you are going to vote and all that stuff, you should have all the information available. And a lot of this social justice stuff is relevant to what's happening now, and a lot of it is also like we're woefully ignorant of it, especially when it comes to like the application of economics in the third world and the developing world and things like that. I guess third world's not the word anymore. So trying to really find a way to take what I've learned in the last year and turn it into fruitful teaching material. So which means it's hard because it can't be dogmatic. Right. It's so easy to fall into that. And that's where that whole like cliche of the professor who whatever, I try really hard not to be that. And I have really generally good relationships with my more conservative students because I'm really respectful of their opinions. I grew up that way. That's my family. But at the same time, some of these things that I've learned about, say, the history of immigration or the effective altruism movement, I just think it's things that people should know about. And that's my platform, is the classroom. But again, doing it in a way that balances and respects their traditions and their beliefs and what they're being taught in other courses and from their families, doing it in a way that doesn't push it on them, allows them to make a decision, respecting their decision-making process as well. It's quite the challenge. Yeah. Especially when I believe so wholeheartedly about it. But I really also believe that my job as a teacher is not to teach them what to think, but how to think. I have just choice over the material. So I'm excited to actually jump into that. And really start focusing on that this year. Especially, I think I'm going to base it around the effective altruism movement because it's very optimistic. And optimism is good. I did a couple classes. Like I had one class where the theme was existential threats. And so we talked about asteroids, we talked about robots, we talked about AI. And by the end of it, everybody's so depressed. And I was like, okay, maybe a little less heavy next time.
A little more optimism.
Yeah. So.
Incredible. Yeah. Incredible. So where can people find you? You're on Instagram. I'll link to that.
Yeah, Instagram is basically what I use now.
Okay.
I had like a blog for my sci-fi writing. I don't do that anymore.
Okay.
Because it's just too much work to keep up. And so, yeah, I do everything through Instagram. All my sci-fi writing, all my literature stuff, all my teaching stuff, all my climbing stuff is all through my Instagram now. So my Instagram has become a smorgasbord of all the things I'm interested in. I'm also I might try to do, with the third book, I might try to do a Kickstarter to get a print run going. So people keep an eye out for that, I guess, if they're interested in supporting that. That's assuming that I decide to go through with the third edition. I probably will because it's fun. There's always like that imposter syndrome and all that kind of stuff, right? That's difficult to get past. In the training book, there's some email information and stuff like that in the beginning too. I still like the Boulder Bushido email. I still get that, so that's fine if they want to contact me there. But really, Instagram is the best way.
Okay.
And I make it a point to respond to everybody who ever asks me anything on Instagram, regardless of what it's about. I really have had some interesting, fruitful conversations with strangers online. The internet is a terrible, scary, frightening place, but there are some good things.
There are some good things.
So I encourage people, if they have questions about anything, to hit me up. I'm always happy to have a conversation about literally anything. I spent a lot of time in the summer arguing religion with people on Instagram, which again, maybe not always super fruitful, but pretty interesting. Like long form, week-long conversations, I think is okay.
Wow.
And had quite a bit of fun about it.
Cool.
And I think also had respectful conversations with people that were interesting. So yeah, that's basically where they can find, and if there's stickers and literature and book recommendations and pictures of my dog. So.
And what's your handle?
Boulder Bushido.
Boulder Bushido.
So Boulder, Boulder, Bushido, Bushido, no caps, no spaces, nothing. Just
okay.
like that.
Perfect. I'll link to it in the show notes.
Cool. Thank you.
And I'll put a downloadable PDF link to your training book.
Yeah.
And I'll link to your Amazon.
If people find it useful, they are free to give it out to anybody they want.
Awesome.
They can print it if they want. I've had people ask about that, if it's okay to print it. You can disseminate that information. I guess the only thing I would be upset about is if somebody put their name on it, but I'm not too worried about it. But yeah, the goal, number one motto in my life is to be useful. And that's what the book is for. So if you find it useful, share it. And if somebody else finds it useful, great. I'm super happy about that.
Well, thanks, man. This conversation has been incredibly interesting and very useful.
Well, thank you. I've had a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's been really fun chatting with you over the past few days, and I'm really glad that we got a chance to fit this in before you took off.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me air out some of my ideas, and thanks for doing what you're doing. Also, I think it's really cool. I did a little bit of research on your podcast the other night and looked at some of the people that you've had, and I'm in good company, I think. Way better company than I deserve. And I like what you're doing, and some of these questions are super insightful, and I like that you get past the climbing a little bit. I think that's really interesting and really good. And then hopefully our paths will cross again one day and we can climb together more.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah.
I selfishly hope you come back.
Yeah.
It'd be fun to.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun on tequila yesterday, and I figured out a key piece of beta.
Awesome.
That I think unlocked it, and so now I really want to come back.
Awesome. I'd love to at least try the stand start.
It's so good.
We can
it's so hard and so good.
I can donate some pads.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, it's got quite the spicy top hat, which I hate. I don't like high top hats. Cool. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
Yeah.
Drive safe today. Cheers.
Cheers. That's fun.
Hey friends, a couple quick things before you go. Carlos' training book, Training 102, is available as a downloadable PDF in the show notes for this episode. You can find those at thenuggetclimbing.com, and there should be a link right there in your podcast app. I also shared the reading list we talked about earlier in the episode and every other book we mentioned, and I linked to both of Carlos' sci-fi books, The Void Within and The Void Beyond, which are both available on Amazon. And I also linked to Carlos' Instagram. As he mentioned, he plans to give all 3 of his books away for free on Kindle when the 3rd one publishes later this month. So be sure to give him a follow so you don't miss that announcement when the book drops. And I will be sure to share that on the Nugget Climbing Instagram as well. Which reminds me, I recently decided to level up my Instagram game, and I'll be adding more photos and stories and add-ons to these episodes in posts. So if you want to learn more about my guests and see photos and other content that relates to something we talked about in an episode, or get more resources that are related, I will be doing a lot more of that on Instagram. So if you don't already, be sure to follow at The Nugget Climbing so you don't miss anything. I've noticed Instagram is also an excellent way to share your favorite episodes, either by referencing them in a post or by sharing them in a story. Be sure to tag me if you do. I always appreciate it, and I think it really helps grow the podcast and reach new listeners, which is awesome. So again, follow Carlos at Boulder Bushido, all one word, and follow the podcast at The Nugget Climbing. Links to everything in the show notes. If you want to support the podcast, you can do that at thenuggetclimbing.com. Share your favorite episodes, leave a rating on your podcast app, all the things. I appreciate all of it. And most of all, thank you so much for listening.
There's no one can